In 1942, the Nazis created a camp with no barracks, no work, no future, only death. This was Treblinka. Here, in just over a year of operation, more than 800,000 men and women were murdered in one of the most concentrated campaigns of extermination in human history. Trains arrived daily, carrying families torn from their homes, unaware that the journey's end was a gas chamber disguised with cruel deception. Guards carried out their orders with ruthless efficiency, while only a handful of survivors lived to tell the tale of the camp's inner workings. Yet even in this abyss, defiance sparked. In August 1943, prisoners staged a desperate revolt, setting parts of the camp aflame and seizing a brief moment of freedom against impossible odds. By the time Treblinka was dismantled and buried under farmland to erase its existence, the echoes of its crimes had already scarred the world forever. This is the entire story of Treblinka, its construction, its function, its resistance, and its haunting legacy that still demands remembrance. So close your eyes, settle into rest, and let this solemn journey guide you through the shadows of history as you drift into sleep. And before we begin, share in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there, because across countries and generations, we carry the memory together. There is a forest in the northeastern part of what was once the core of occupied Poland, a place where the wind moves through the pines and birches with a quietness that seems almost too deliberate, as if it is aware that it is passing over ground saturated with memory. To walk there today, you might only hear the sound of rustling leaves, the occasional bird call, and the faint drone of insects in the summer air. Nothing in the modern landscape overtly proclaims its history. Yet, 80 years ago, this seemingly unremarkable piece of land would have been the entrance to one of the most devastating sights in human history, a place named Treblinka. To understand the origins of Treblinka is to understand not just a location on a map, but the gradual tightening of a noose that began far from here, in the halls of political power and in the fevered minds of those who dreamt of a world reshaped according to their own inhumane ideals. The story starts not in the forest itself, but in the volatile political climate of Europe between the two world wars. In the wake of the First World War, borders were redrawn, empires were broken up, and resentments were sewn into the fabric of nations. Germany, stripped of its territory and burdened by reparations, harbored a deep sense of humiliation. Economic collapse, political turmoil, and the rise of extremist ideologies provided fertile ground for a man named Adolf Hitler to seize power. The seeds of Treblinka were planted in the rhetoric of his speeches long before any plans for the camp were drawn up. In the relentless drumbeat of anti-Semitism, in the portrayal of Jewish people not as neighbors or fellow citizens, but as an existential threat that needed to be eliminated. By the late 1930s, the Nazi state had transformed anti-Semitism from a mere prejudice into a central tenet of government policy. Discriminatory laws deprived Jewish people of their rights, their livelihoods, and their dignity. Pogroms and public humiliations became state-sanctioned acts. The invasion of Poland in September 1939, which initiated the Second World War, brought millions more Jewish people under Nazi control almost instantaneously. This sudden problem, as the Nazis perceived it, demanded a solution, and those in charge were not interested in a humane one. Initially, the regime considered forced emigration, ghettoization, and mass shootings by mobile killing squads in the East. But these methods, while brutally effective in the short run, were seen by the Nazi leadership as inefficient, too visible, and psychologically taxing on the perpetrators. They sought something that could be scaled up, concealed from the outside world, and operated like an industrial process. The forests of the general government, the central and eastern territories of occupied Poland, presented a dark opportunity. Remote, sparsely populated, and already under firm German control, these areas could hide vast operations from the prying eyes of the world. They also had rail connections that could transport human cargo from across occupied Europe directly to secluded killing sites. Treblinka, a small village near the Bug River, had no particular significance or strategic value before the war. In that respect, it was exactly what the Nazis were looking for, an unremarkable place that could be converted into a machine of annihilation without attracting much attention until it was too late. The roots of Treblinka as a death camp can be traced back to an earlier, seemingly unrelated program, Action T4, the Nazi euthanasia initiative that began in 1939. In this program, people with disabilities, mental illnesses, or other conditions deemed life unworthy of life by the regime were murdered in specially designed gas chambers disguised as medical facilities. This was where the technology, methods, and personnel for industrialized killing were first developed and refined. When Action T4 officially ceased in 1941 due to public pressure within Germany, many of its key figures were quietly transferred to a new mission in the East, the construction and operation of extermination camps under what became known as Operation Reinhard. Operation Reinhard was the codename for the plan to murder the Jewish population of the general government. It led to the establishment of 3 primary death camps, Bołżek, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Each would adhere to the same fundamental design principles perfected during Action T4, deception, speed, and absolute secrecy. Victims would be brought in by train, led to believe they were being relocated for work, and then murdered within hours of their arrival. Their bodies would be buried, and later cremated in an effort to leave no trace of the crime. In early 1942, construction started near the Treblinka railway station, but not at the station itself. The camp was situated about 4 kilometers away, connected by a spur line that branched off from the main Warsaw-Białystok railway. This meant that once a transport train left the main line, it disappeared into the forest, out of sight of ordinary travelers. The choice of location was not just about concealment. The surrounding sandy soil was easy to excavate, a grim advantage for digging mass graves. The area was sparsely inhabited, reducing the chances of casual witnesses, and it was close enough to major rail lines to bring in victims from Warsaw, Lublin, Radom, and beyond, with minimal disruption. Even before the camp opened, the name Treblinka was already known to the local population in a darker context. Just months earlier, in 1941, the Nazis had established Treblinka A, a penal labor camp located about 2 kilometers from where the death camp would be built. The prisoners there, mostly Poles accused of resisting the occupation or violating German laws, faced brutal conditions and high mortality rates. This labor camp served as a cover story for the initial stages of construction. Locals who saw barbed wire going up and guards on patrol might have assumed it was simply an expansion of the existing penal facility, not the creation of a place designed for the mass murder of hundreds of thousands. What makes the origin story of Treblinka particularly chilling is the speed and efficiency with which it was created. The initial phase of construction was finished in just a few weeks in mid-1942. Timber from the surrounding forest was used to build barracks, fences, and watchtowers. Local laborers, often working under coercion, laid the tracks and cleared the land without understanding the full purpose of their work. German and Ukrainian guards, many of whom were veterans of Action T4, began to arrive. These men brought with them not just experience in killing, but a hardened detachment, that would be crucial to the camp's operation. From the very beginning, secrecy was paramount. Orders were given orally whenever possible to minimize written evidence. Workers who knew too much were sometimes executed. The camp was divided into separate zones, one for administration and housing, another for receiving transports, and a third hidden behind high fences and camouflage where the killing took place. The very layout of Treblinka was designed to prevent any victim from understanding the full picture until it was far too late. If one could have stood in the forest in those early months of 1942, the signs of what was to come might have seemed ambiguous. The new rail spur under construction, the sound of hammering, the movement of guards. But within the plans drawn up by the camp's designers, there was no ambiguity at all. This was to be a place where up to 10,000 people a day could be murdered without a pause, where trains would arrive in a relentless rhythm, and where the dead would leave no visible trace above ground. In that sense, Treblinka was not just a location, it was the physical embodiment of an ideology, one that sought not only to destroy a people, but to erase their very existence from memory. By the summer of 1942, the war in the East was raging. German armies had pushed deep into Soviet territory, but the quick victory Hitler had anticipated was proving to be elusive. The war effort required vast resources, and in the minds of the Nazi leadership, this was all the more reason to accelerate the so-called final solution. Treblinka's role was now clearly defined. It would be the largest of the Operation Reinhard camps, responsible for the majority of deportations from the Warsaw ghetto and other major Jewish communities in central Poland. The men chosen to run it were not improvising amateurs, they were specialists in death. At the center was Irmfried Ebel, a physician by training and one of the few camp commandants with a medical background. His career before Treblinka had been in the T4 program, where he had overseen the gassing of disabled people in Germany and Austria. Ebel's appointment was a reflection of the belief that Treblinka should operate with the precision and speed of a medical procedure, cold, detached, and efficient. He was joined by a staff of SS officers, German administrators, and a contingent of Ukrainian guards trained at the Trawniki camp. These men shared a common understanding. Treblinka was not a labor camp, not a prison, but a pure killing center. In Warsaw, the machinery of deportation was already being set in motion. Nazi authorities were distributing false notices about resettlement to the east, promising work and better living conditions. The reality was far darker. Transports were being assembled at the Umschlagplatz, the railway loading area on the edge of the ghetto. Cattle cars, packed with human beings to the point of suffocation, would embark on a journey that lasted for hours, sometimes days, without food or water. The final destination of these journeys was the small, remote Treblinka station, where the new spur line branched off into the forest and towards the camp's gates. The very geography of Treblinka was a weapon. As the train approached, passengers could see little beyond the sandy embankments, the dense pine forests, and the wooden guard towers that began to appear at intervals. There were no smokestacks or chimneys visible from the arrival area, no large buildings that might suggest an industrial operation. This was intentional. The Nazis had learned from earlier killing sites that the longer they could delay panic, the easier it was to control large numbers of victims. In Treblinka, the deception began before a single person stepped off the train. Construction crews had built false facades to create the illusion of a functioning transit station. There was a sign with the name Treblinka in neat letters, a clock painted on a board, and even a wooden ticket booth. These details were not meant to convince anyone for long. They only needed to soothe or confuse for a few minutes, just enough time to drive people forward into a system from which there was no return. Beyond the arrival platform, fences made of woven pine branches concealed what lay ahead. The path into the killing area, later called the Tube by survivors, was fenced on both sides and twisted so that no one could see the gas chambers until they were right in front of them. In the earliest days, however, Treblinka was far from running smoothly. Ebel, eager to demonstrate his camp's capacity, ordered more deportations than the facility could handle. Trains arrived in quick succession, sometimes several in a single day, overwhelming the limited number of gas chambers then in operation. Corpses piled up, burial pits filled faster than they could be dug, and the stench of decay began to permeate the air. This overzealousness became a problem for the Nazis, not because of any moral concern, but because it risked attracting unwanted attention. Complaints from railway workers and German officials in nearby towns forced higher authorities to intervene. It was during this chaotic period that Treblinka's command structure was changed. Ebel was removed and replaced by Franz Stangl, an Austrian SS officer who had also served in the T4 program. Stangl brought discipline and order, qualities that made him an effective, if utterly ruthless, administrator. Under his leadership, the camp was expanded. More gas chambers were built, burial areas were reorganized, and the entire process was streamlined so that each transport could be processed in a matter of hours. In a grotesque perversion of normal life, success at Treblinka was measured by the number of human beings murdered per day. By late summer 1942, the deportations from Warsaw were in full swing. Each train that disappeared into the Treblinka forest was swallowed by silence. The surrounding villages, though small and scattered, began to notice strange occurrences. Farmers saw more German patrols, the railway carried more and more sealed freight cars, and the air sometimes carried a heavy, acrid smell. But speaking openly about such things was dangerous, and many chose not to ask questions they were afraid to have answered. A few local Poles risked their lives to pass information to underground resistance networks, but the vast scale of what was happening was difficult for anyone to grasp. The idea of making Treblinka disappear began almost from its inception, its location in the woods, the deceptive station facade, the barriers hiding the killing area. All these elements were part of a larger effort to keep it invisible. The Nazis never intended for Treblinka to be a permanent feature of the landscape. In their minds, it was a temporary machine designed to achieve a specific goal: the extermination of the Jewish population in this part of occupied Poland. When that was accomplished, they planned to dismantle it completely, leaving behind nothing that could serve as evidence. What makes the origins of Treblinka so haunting is the contrast between its small physical size and the vastness of its intended impact. The camp covered only a fraction of a square kilometer. It had no sprawling factories or vast barracks like Auschwitz. And yet, in just over a year of operation, it would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands. It was proof that destruction on an unimaginable scale could be carried out from a place so modest in size that it might vanish entirely from the surface of the earth when the killing was done. Looking back, the signs were there for those who could see them. The sudden flurry of construction in the forest, the arrival of men hardened in earlier killing programs, the secrecy that enveloped every step. But in the summer of 1942, Treblinka's gates were only just opening, and the worst was yet to come. The camp stood ready, hidden among the trees, waiting for the trains that would begin to arrive in a relentless rhythm, carrying their human cargo toward a fate that no one inside those cars could yet imagine. In that sense, the shadows that gathered in the forest before Treblinka's full operation were not just the physical ones cast by the tall pines in the late afternoon sun. They were the deepening shadows of a catastrophe that would soon consume the lives of so many and leave an emptiness where their voices should have been. To understand why Treblinka was chosen as one of the central killing grounds of the Holocaust, one must first step into the landscape of occupied Poland in 1942, a place crisscrossed by rail lines, dotted with small villages, and covered in stretches of forest that from a military point of view were more than just natural scenery. To the German occupiers, the very remoteness and obscurity of some areas made them ideal for the most secret and terrible tasks. And Treblinka, tucked away in the Masovian countryside near the Bug River, seemed to offer every advantage for a crime that needed to be hidden in plain sight. Before the war, Treblinka was barely more than a name on a map, a cluster of rural settlements surrounded by sandy soil and thin pine woods. There was a small railway station on the Warsaw-Białystok line, but it served mostly local traffic, farmers transporting produce, villagers travelling to market towns. The station itself was modest, a simple wooden building with a platform and a few sidings. Life here was slow-paced, shaped by the rhythm of planting, harvesting, and the changing seasons. It was this very ordinariness that appealed to the planners of Operation Reinhard. If you wanted to hide a place where hundreds of thousands of people would vanish, you did not choose somewhere already under the gaze of the world. You chose somewhere that barely registered in the imagination of outsiders. The strategic thinking behind the site selection was chilling in its clarity. Treblinka lay far enough from major cities to avoid easy observation, yet close enough to the Warsaw ghetto to make mass deportations logistically simple. The railway connection meant that transports could be scheduled without drawing undue attention, blending into the constant wartime movement of goods, troops, and prisoners. The surrounding population was sparse and mostly rural, with limited access to communication beyond local gossip, and gossip under occupation could be silenced swiftly and brutally. The sandy ground, so troublesome for farmers, was a gift to the camp's planners, easy to dig, easy to fill, and in their minds easier to erase when the time came. Geography was not the only consideration. There was already a precedent for using the area as a site of imprisonment and death. The penal labor camp, opened in 1941, had been established to punish Poles accused of resistance or other crimes against the occupation authorities. Prisoners there felled timber, quarried gravel, and performed exhausting labor under constant guard. The camp's presence meant that German control of the immediate area was already established. Guard towers, barbed wire, and the sight of prisoners in striped uniforms had become part of the local landscape, dulling curiosity and normalizing the idea that something grim was taking place behind the fences. When the decision was made to build Treblinka II, the extermination camp, the location offered another grim advantage: its closeness to the Bug River. The river not only provided a natural barrier, but also served as a transport route for goods and materials, while the camp itself would rely on the rail spur for bringing in its victims. The availability of water nearby was useful for construction and for the camp's own internal needs. To the planners, all these factors meshed neatly into a vision of efficiency. Yet, perhaps the most decisive reason Treblinka was chosen was psychological. The Nazis understood that mass killing on such a scale could not happen in a place where the victims had a chance of being seen, heard, or remembered by the outside world. They needed a location where screams would fade into the rustle of the forest, where smoke could drift upward and vanish into the clouds without too many eyes to watch it. The remoteness of Treblinka offered exactly that kind of concealment. In their calculations, distance equaled silence. By early 1942, as the final solution shifted from planning to full-scale implementation, the blueprint for Treblinka began to take shape. The men of the SS and their civilian collaborators studied maps, railway timetables, and supply lines. They calculated how many trains could pass through Warsaw each day, how quickly they could be diverted along the spur to Treblinka, and how many victims could be unloaded and killed in a given span of hours. The camp was not to be a detention center. There would be no large population of prisoners kept alive for labor. Its purpose was single, absolute, and immediate: the killing of those who arrived. Local villagers saw activity increase around the small station that spring. Timber was brought in, and earth was moved in great mounds. Some of the work was done by hired laborers, some by prisoners from Treblinka. Few, if any, of them knew the full truth of what they were building. The Germans were careful to reveal only what was necessary, and the threat of violence discouraged speculation. A man who asked too many questions might be arrested, beaten, or simply disappear. In the strange, suspended reality of occupation, silence was often the safest choice. The location also allowed the Nazis to manipulate appearances in a way that was key to their strategy of deception. Victims arriving from the Warsaw ghetto or other deportation points would be told they were going to a transit camp on the way to a new life in the East. Treblinka's remoteness made that lie plausible. Few people in the ghettos had ever heard of the place, and the very obscurity of its name gave it a kind of blankness onto which the Nazis could project whatever fiction they needed. When the trains rolled away from familiar stations and into the countryside, there was nothing in the passing landscape to contradict the story, just forests, fields, and the occasional village slipping by in the distance. All of this careful planning served a single monstrous end. The remoteness that shielded Treblinka from outside interference also ensured that those brought there would be swallowed in isolation. Once the spur line curved away from the main railway, the world outside ceased to exist for those inside the cattle cars. There were no witnesses, no avenues of escape, no chance for a desperate signal to reach a sympathetic ear. In the geography of genocide, Treblinka was a black hole into which lives were drawn, and from which nothing emerged. This remoteness did not mean the camp was invisible forever. There were inevitably small leaks of knowledge, railway workers who noticed trains going out full and coming back empty, villagers who saw smoke where no factory stood, whispers among the forced labourers at Treblinka. But such fragments of truth rarely coalesced into a full picture until long after the killing had ended. For most of its operation, Treblinka's location shielded it as effectively as the barbed wire that surrounded its perimeter. The choice of this place was no accident, no matter how ordinary it might have appeared on a map before the war. In the minds of the planners, the location of Treblinka was as essential to its function as the gas chambers themselves. Without remoteness, there could be no secrecy. Without secrecy, the industrial scale of the killing might falter. And so this quiet corner of Poland, once just another patch of forest and field, was drawn into the very center of the most radical and terrible project the Nazis had ever undertaken. In that moment, Treblinka ceased to be simply a place. It became an idea, a calculated intersection of geography, logistics, and ideology, chosen precisely because it could disappear again when the work was done. When Franz Stangl arrived to take command of Treblinka in late August 1942, the camp's location was already proving to be both its greatest asset and, briefly, its early vulnerability. The remoteness meant that every plank, every nail, every piece of machinery had to be brought in along the narrow roads or by the newly built rail spur. Supplies travelled from depots in Warsaw or Malkinia, carried by train and wagon, and were unloaded in the shadow of the pines. This made construction slower in the early stages, but it also meant that the camp was insulated from the ebb and flow of civilian life. No large industrial centres lay nearby, no prying journalists or foreign officials passed through. The forest swallowed sound and movement like a sponge. Under Stangl's disciplined direction, the camp's physical isolation was paired with a psychological one. The surrounding villages were kept at a distance, with roadblocks and guard patrols preventing unauthorized travel. The Germans took over nearby houses and barns for their own use, further discouraging locals from lingering in the area. They also used intimidation to ensure compliance. Stories circulated of people being shot for trespassing too close to the perimeter, their bodies left in view as warnings. The message was simple: this was forbidden ground. The station itself, modest though it was, became a kind of stage set for the deception at the heart of Treblinka's function. From a distance, the spur line appeared like any other wartime rail extension, perhaps built for moving timber or military supplies. But the design of its final approach was deliberate. The track curved so that those in the cattle cars could not see what lay ahead until they were practically at the platform. The fences were high, the gates solid, and beyond them lay only glimpses of guard towers and buildings painted in plain colors that gave nothing away. The forest pressed in on all sides, framing the camp like a wall of green. From an operational standpoint, Treblinka's remoteness also gave it flexibility. Trains could be scheduled at irregular hours without drawing attention. Sometimes they arrived at dawn, sometimes in the heat of the afternoon, sometimes under cover of darkness. The camp's killing operations did not depend on daylight. At night, the only signs were the dim glow of lamps behind the fences and the occasional glint of moonlight on the rails. To an outsider passing by on the main Warsaw-Białystok line, there was nothing to suggest that less than a few kilometers away, entire transports of people were being erased. The sandy soil, chosen for its ease of excavation, presented challenges of its own. Mass graves had to be dug deep enough to contain the staggering number of bodies, yet the loose ground made cave-ins a constant risk. The Nazis solved this with a combination of wider pits and timber bracing, all done in secluded areas, shielded from the platform by fences and camouflage netting. The proximity of the Bug River allowed them to haul in additional water for the camp's needs, though this too had to be managed carefully to avoid creating visible traffic patterns that could alert locals. In a sense, Treblinka's location became a character in the story, a silent accomplice that worked alongside its human operators. The isolation muffled the sounds of the gas chambers, the gunshots, the engines running for hours. It absorbed the smoke and smell, dispersing them into the vast open sky above the forests. It offered concealment for stockpiles of stolen belongings, hidden in storage sheds and buried in the sand, and it made the disappearance of the camp, when the time came, far easier to achieve. When the Nazis decided in 1943 to dismantle Treblinka, the same remoteness that had kept it hidden from the outside world allowed them to plow over its remains without attracting notice. This isolation also shaped the survivors' stories. For those few who managed to escape the camp, the journey back to the wider world meant passing again through that dead zone of forest and field, where every farmhouse and every path could be a place of danger. The remoteness that had trapped them within the camp did not immediately offer safety once they were outside. They had to navigate an environment that for many was hostile or indifferent, still under the watchful eye of German patrols. The Nazis had learned lessons from other killing sites. In places where executions took place closer to towns, rumors spread faster, morale among troops sometimes wavered, and the risk of exposure grew. Treblinka's location minimized all of this. The nearest sizable population centers were far enough away that casual observation was nearly impossible. Even Polish railway workers who handled the incoming trains often had only a partial understanding of the camp's true purpose. Some guessed, some feared, but few had the full picture. The camp's physical placement acted like a filter, controlling not only who could see it, but also what they could comprehend about it. There is an irony in the fact that the very obscurity which made Treblinka ideal for its intended purpose also made it, in later decades, a place that seemed almost to vanish from the historical map. For years after the war, it was easier for people to imagine Auschwitz, with its sprawling barracks and industrial chimneys, than Treblinka, which had left behind so little. The camp's remoteness, its small physical footprint, and the deliberate erasure by the Nazis meant that for many, the name Treblinka existed more in testimony than in tangible ruins. And yet, in that quiet corner of the Masovian landscape, the ground remembers. Beneath the grass and the scattered stones lie the traces of the pits, the scattered ash, the tiny fragments of bone that resist the passage of time. The forest has grown back, the rail spur is gone, and the station has returned to its modest civilian use. But the reasons the Nazis chose Treblinka, its distance, its concealment, its silence, still linger in the air. To walk there today is to sense the deliberate logic of its placement, a logic born of cruelty but executed with the precision of a military operation. The remoteness of Treblinka was not just about hiding a crime, it was about making that crime possible on a scale that defied the imagination. The planners knew that if their work was to proceed without interruption, the victims had to vanish into a place from which no word, no sound, no trace could escape. In that way, the forest and the fields became as much a part of the machinery of death as the engines, the rails, and the chambers themselves. It is a sobering reminder that geography is never neutral. In the hands of those who wield power without conscience, even the quietest corner of the world can be turned into a place of unfathomable darkness. The first sketches for Treblinka de Sicken, the extermination camp, were never drawn with the permanence of an architect's blueprint for a civic building or a factory. They were not meant to endure in archives or be displayed in proud portfolios. They were likely rough diagrams, passed from one SS officer to another, amended in pencil, committed to memory, and destroyed when their purpose was served. Yet within those unrecorded lines lay the framework for one of the most efficient killing machines ever devised, a place designed not for habitation, production, or defense, but solely for the elimination of human life. The men responsible for translating the idea of Treblinka from concept to reality were not amateurs in the realm of mass killing. Most had cut their teeth in the Action T4 euthanasia program, where they had learned how to adapt buildings and technology to the task of murder. They carried that experience eastward under the umbrella of Operation Reinhard, applying lessons learned in places like Hartheim, Hadamar, and Sonnenstein. For them, the challenge at Treblinka was not moral but logistical: how to construct a facility in a remote location, using available materials that could receive, kill, and dispose of thousands of people every day with minimal delay. The site was cleared in the early months of 1942, when snow still lingered in the forest shadows and the ground, though sandy, was cold to the touch. Prisoners from Treblinka iron local forced labourers began felling pines, digging foundations, and hauling in timbers. German overseers barked orders, while Ukrainian guards, already armed and uniformed, kept watch with their rifles slung casually in the crook of their arms. Every movement of earth and wood was deliberate. There was no pretense of building a barracks for workers or a depot for goods. The layout followed a grim template already tested at Beuzek and Sobibor: separation of functions, controlled movement, and concealment of the killing process from those about to be killed. The camp was divided into distinct zones, each with its own purpose. Closest to the railway spur lay the reception area, the point where the trains would disgorge their human cargo. This space had to look, for at least a few moments, like a place of transit rather than a place of death. A small wooden station building was erected, along with a painted sign bearing the name Treblinka and a clock face that never moved. Gravel paths led from the platform into the camp, bordered by freshly cut pine boughs woven into the fences that hid what lay beyond. The deception was deliberate and calculated. The smoother the arrival, the less likely that panic would disrupt the schedule. Beyond the reception zone lay the undressing yard, an open area where men, women and children would be separated, ordered to remove their clothing, and told to tie their shoes together. Piles of belongings would be sorted, valuables collected in sacks, and clothing stacked for later transport. Around this space, tall fences and watchtowers ensured there was no view into the killing area, a section of the camp shielded not only from the outside world, but from those inside until the last possible moment. The undressing yard was one of the first points where the camp's psychological control became absolute. Guards shouted instructions, sometimes with feigned politeness, sometimes with whips or rifle butts. The lie of resettlement was maintained almost to the threshold of the gas chambers. The heart of Treblinka's design lay in the tube, a narrow, fenced-in path that led from the undressing yard to the gas chambers. The tube was not a straight line. It curved and bent, so that the chambers were hidden from view until the final steps. The fences along its sides were made of wooden frames filled with branches, giving the impression of a rustic enclosure, but effectively blocking any sight or escape. The length of the tube served to funnel people in small groups, reducing the chance of resistance and ensuring that the killing area never became overcrowded. The first gas chambers at Treblinka were modest in size, built of wood, each with a heavy, tightly sealed door. Inside, the walls were lined with boards to muffle the sound. The chambers were powered not by chemical pellets, as in Auschwitz, but by carbon monoxide produced by a large engine, a technology adapted directly from Action T4, where vehicle exhaust had been used for the same purpose. The exhaust pipes were fed through openings in the chamber walls, and once the doors were shut, the lethal gas filled the space within minutes. Victims collapsed where they stood, pressed together in the darkness. Adjacent to the chambers lay the burial pits, vast trenches dug deep into the sandy soil. These were prepared in advance, their scale calculated to hold thousands of bodies. In the earliest phase, the dead were simply piled into these pits and covered with sand. The work of moving the corpses fell to a Sonderkommando of Jewish prisoners, kept alive for a few weeks or months at most, who labored under constant guard and the threat of immediate execution. The sandy ground made the digging easier, but it also meant that after a rain, the earth would sink and shift, sometimes exposing fragments of the bodies beneath. From the outset, Treblinka's design was meant to be adaptable. As deportations accelerated and the number of arrivals swelled, the camp could be modified to increase its capacity. More gas chambers could be added, the pits expanded, and the tube widened. This flexibility was built into the blueprint from the beginning, a recognition that the killing process would need to keep pace with the Nazi timetable for the destruction of Poland's Jews. There was a precision to the layout that, in another context, might have been admired as engineering efficiency: the distance from the platform to the undressing yard, from the undressing yard to the gas chamber, from the gas chamber to the burial pit. Each was calculated to keep the flow of victims constant, to avoid bottlenecks that could lead to chaos. The guards' barracks were positioned to overlook key points, enabling them to monitor without crowding the prisoners. Storage huts for stolen goods stood just far enough from the killing area to be kept free of panic, allowing them to be methodically inventoried. What is most chilling is that the men who planned this space saw it not as a place of horror, but as a logistical challenge to be met. They spoke of throughput and processing as if discussing a factory line. They measured success in the number of transports handled in a day, the number of bodies buried without delay. The blueprint of Treblinka was the blueprint of genocide in its purest, most unadorned form, the reduction of human beings to a problem of movement, containment and disposal. By the time the camp neared completion in July 1942, it was ready to receive its first transports from the Warsaw ghetto. The men in charge walked the grounds, inspecting the fences, testing the gas chambers, and timing the sequence from arrival to death. The trees around the perimeter remained in place, their branches intertwined with camouflage netting. From outside the fence there was little to see, only the tops of the watchtowers and the occasional movement of armed men along the perimeter. The railway spur gleamed in the sun, a silent invitation to the trains that would soon bring their cargo of lives to be extinguished. The blueprint had moved from paper and memory into physical form. Treblinka stood complete, not as a monument or a fortress, but as an instrument, one that would operate without pause for little more than a year, yet in that time become the site of one of the most concentrated waves of killing in history. Every fence post, every plank, every shovel of sand had been placed according to a plan whose sole purpose was to make death efficient. If the outer structures of Treblinka embodied deception and control, the inner workings reflected a dark efficiency honed by prior experiments in killing. The men who oversaw the construction understood that in a camp like this, the architecture was only part of the design. The rest lay in human choreography. Every guard, every prisoner laborer, every barrier and every path had its role in the seamless progression from arrival to annihilation. One of the camp's most striking features was its use of sightlines, or rather the calculated elimination of them. A visitor standing in the reception area could not see the gas chambers from the undressing yard. The pits where the bodies were buried remained invisible. The fences along the tube were tall enough to prevent any glimpse beyond them, and their coverings of pine boughs and reed mats made them look like a rustic wall rather than a prison barricade. This concealment served a dual purpose. It maintained the deception for the victims, and it insulated the camp personnel from the full sensory weight of their own actions. The process became compartmentalized, as though each area were part of a separate enterprise, each with its own specialized workers. The guards' barracks, administrative huts, and storage buildings were clustered in a separate section of the camp, away from the killing zone. Here, daily routines unfolded with a chilling normalcy. Meals were served, uniforms were cleaned, and orders were reviewed. The soundscape of this area might have been that of any military post. The scrape of boots on wooden floors, the clink of mess tins, the murmur of conversation, all within earshot of a place where hundreds or thousands of people might be dying in a single day. This separation was deliberate, allowing the camp staff to exist in a physical and mental buffer zone, stepping into the killing process only when necessary. The storage area for stolen goods was an integral part of the camp's economy. In long wooden sheds, clothing was sorted by size and quality, shoes were paired and stacked, and valuables were separated into categories. Gold teeth extracted from the corpses, jewelry, currency, watches, even eyeglasses. Prisoner laborers worked here under guard, stripping away any trace of the item's original owners. In Nazi reports, this was described in the language of resource recovery, as if the possessions of murdered people were merely materials to be recycled. The thoroughness of this operation left nothing unused. Even the hair shaved from the heads of women before they entered the gas chambers was packed into sacks for shipment to German factories, where it was woven into felt or used for insulation. Central to Treblinka's function was the engine room, a small, grim building whose presence was felt more in its output than its appearance. Here, large petrol engines, likely taken from captured Soviet tanks or trucks, were maintained by mechanics who understood their deadly purpose. The engines were started in coordination with the arrival of each group at the gas chambers, and the carbon monoxide was channeled through pipes into the sealed rooms, the process continuing until silence replaced the muffled cries inside. There was no clocking in and clocking out for this work. It was dictated by the rhythm of the transports. The burial pits, vast and deep, were not fixed monuments, but evolving features of the camp. As the space in one pit filled, another would be dug. The sandy soil made the excavation relatively easy, but it also carried the stench upward. In the warmer months, this became impossible to ignore, drawing clouds of flies and seeping into the air despite attempts at covering. Later in Treblinka's operation, this problem would lead to the introduction of cremation pits, open-air pyres where the bodies were burned on iron grates laid over stone supports. But in the early days, burial was the norm, and the pits were integral to the blueprint's original logic. An important but less visible component of the camp's design was the railway infrastructure. The siding that branched off from the main line allowed trains to arrive and depart without interrupting other traffic. The platform was just long enough to accommodate a transport of 20 or more cattle cars, each packed with hundreds of people. The schedule was tight. A train would arrive, its human cargo would be unloaded, and the empty cars would be cleaned or simply pulled away for the next load. This precision meant that the camp could operate in a continuous cycle with minimal downtime between arrivals. The men in charge of Treblinka's construction, figures like SS officer Ermfried Ebel, the camp's first commandant, and Odilo Globochnik, the head of Operation Reinhard, viewed the camp not as a fixed creation, but as a prototype that could be refined. Within weeks of its opening, the original wooden gas chambers were deemed too small for the volume of deportees arriving from Warsaw and other ghettos. New, larger chambers of brick and concrete were built, increasing the camp's killing capacity many times over. This adaptability was part of the design from the start. The camp was built with expansion in mind, as though the architects anticipated the escalation of mass murder. In this design, there was an almost industrial abstraction of purpose. Victims were seen not as people, but as units in a process, unloaded, processed, disposed of. The blueprint accounted for flow rates, delays, and contingencies. If a train was late, the guards remained ready. If the burial pits filled, new ones were dug. If the gas chambers broke down, temporary measures were improvised. This mechanical problem-solving mindset gave the camp a horrifying resilience, allowing it to function almost without pause for over a year. The camouflage that surrounded Treblinka extended beyond the physical barriers. From the outside, the camp's existence was shrouded in official secrecy. Locals in nearby villages might hear the trains, might notice the increased military presence, might even catch the smell that drifted on the wind, but they were kept at a distance by the guards and by fear. German propaganda referred to resettlement camps in the east, maintaining the fiction that the deportees were being relocated for labor. The true purpose of Treblinka was known only to those who worked within its fences, and to them it was a duty to be carried out without question. By the time Treblinka's design reached its final operational form, it had become the epitome of a factory of death. Every component, the reception platform, the undressing yard, the tube, the gas chambers, the pits, fit together into a closed system with a single, irreversible outcome. There was no way back through the tube, no alternative exit, no reprieve. The blueprint ensured that once a person entered, the process would carry them to its predetermined end without deviation. And yet, in this place of mechanical death, there were still human hands that built the fences, hammered the nails, and dug the pits. Many of them were prisoners, compelled under the threat of immediate execution to construct the very machinery that would soon consume them. For them, every post set in the ground, Every board nailed into place was both a survival tactic and an act of building their own prison. They lived in the shadow of the blueprint, caught between the will to survive and the knowledge of what that survival demanded. By late summer 1942, Treblinka was ready to operate at full capacity. The blueprint had been tested, refined, and expanded. The engines were in place, the chambers were sealed, the tube was complete. Guards stood in their towers, Ukrainian auxiliaries patrolled the paths, and the trains began to arrive in a steady rhythm that would not slow until the following year. The camp was no longer an idea on paper. It was a functioning reality, one that would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands before its brief existence came to an end. In the stillness of the surrounding forest, the blueprint had become something far more than a plan. It had become an invisible presence, an arrangement of wood, wire, and stone that dictated the fate of every person who stepped inside. It was a creation born of cold logic and moral vacancy, a structure whose efficiency lay not in the skill of its craftsmanship, but in the precision of its cruelty. And though the physical camp would one day be dismantled and buried under the same soil that once received its victims, the blueprint in its essence would remain etched into the memory of history as the design of a place where humanity was undone by its own hands. They came in the early morning, more often than not, the trains, long before the sun had burned away the mist that clung to the fields and pine forests around Treblinka. The rumble could be felt before it was heard, a distant tremor that seemed to pass through the earth itself, carried along the iron rails that wound their way from the ghettos and transit camps of occupied Poland. To those who lived in the small villages nearby, this sound became part of the landscape, like the wind through the trees or the distant tolling of a church bell. But unlike those sounds, the arrival of the trains was always heavy, always accompanied by the knowledge, unspoken but understood, that they carried human lives toward an unseen fate. The deportations to Treblinka followed the rhythm of a timetable, one drawn not on public posters, but in the ledgers and orders of the Reich Main Security Office. From Warsaw, from Białystok, from Radom, from Lublin, the cattle cars would be filled, sometimes with 70, sometimes with more than 100 souls crammed into a single wooden boxcar, with no seats, no toilets, and almost no air. The doors were slid shut and bolted from the outside. Inside, the only light came from the slits in the planks, narrow as a finger, through which a passenger might glimpse a passing field or the blur of a telegraph pole. For those inside, the journey could last for hours or for days. The heat of summer turned the cars into ovens. In winter, the air was sharp and biting, frost forming on the walls from the breath of the passengers. Some had brought small bundles, bread, a blanket, a family keepsake, clutched tightly in the hope that it might be useful at their destination. Others carried nothing at all, having been driven from their homes so suddenly that there had been no time to prepare. The sounds within the cars were their own grim symphony, the cough of the sick, the wail of children, the quiet prayers whispered under breath, the creak and sway of the car itself over the uneven track. In the darker moments, there were also the muffled cries of grief when someone collapsed and did not rise again, when the stifling air and the press of bodies claimed a life before the train had even reached its destination. There was nowhere to lay the dead except among the living, a burden that grew heavier as the hours passed. Outside, the train passed through a landscape that seemed indifferent to its cargo. Farmers bent to their work in the fields, and villagers carried baskets of bread or pails of milk along the dirt roads. Children played by the streams and in the orchards. Some stopped to watch as the train clattered by, their eyes following the sealed cars, catching a fleeting glimpse of faces at the slits in the wood. A few might wave, uncertain of who rode inside, though most simply stared in silence. The final approach to Treblinka began at a small station on the main line, where the transport would be diverted onto a spur track that curved into the forest. Here the air changed, not in temperature or colour, but in its weight. The trees grew denser, cutting off the wider view of the countryside. The train slowed, the screech of its brakes echoing against the trunks. The passengers pressed together, could feel the change without seeing it. The wheels ground over the switches, the rhythm of the rails shifting as the spur carried them deeper into the camp's hidden world. From the guard towers, the approach was a signal to prepare. Ukrainian auxiliaries and German SS men took up their positions along the platform and near the unloading area. Prisoner labourers, known as the Blue Squad for the markings on their camp uniforms, were gathered under the watch of armed guards. Their task was to open the doors, to help, or rather to drive, the passengers from the cars, to carry the weak, and to remove any who had died during the journey. The platform at Treblinka was not the grand structure of a city station, but a simple stretch of levelled ground with a covering of gravel, flanked by low wooden buildings. A sign might indicate a fictitious destination, maintaining the charade that this was a transit point rather than the end of the line. Some of the guards played their part in this deception, calling out instructions as though the arrivals would soon be boarding another train. When the doors of the cars slid open, the first sensation for many was the sudden burst of light and air. For a moment it could feel like a reprieve, but that moment passed quickly, replaced by the sharp bark of orders, the glare of the guards, the sight of their weapons. Those too weak to move were pulled out by the prisoner workers. The dead were laid aside without ceremony, their bodies to be dealt with separately. The living were herded into groups, with men separated from women and children in a practiced motion. The division was swift, almost casual, yet absolute. Families called out to one another, reaching across the space, trying to hold on to faces and voices for as long as they could. But the line of guards kept them apart, steering them toward different paths, one for the men, one for the women and children. Through it all, the train itself stood silent now, its work done. The cars that had carried their human load were emptied, sometimes washed out, sometimes left as they were, awaiting the next transport. The engine might detach and return to the main line, or another would arrive to take the cars away. In the records of the Reichsbahn, this was just another completed journey, logged with times and distances, a fee calculated and paid, a transaction without the weight of the lives it had delivered. For the new arrivals, the platform was only the first stage. Ahead lay the undressing yard, the tube and the gas chambers. But in that first moment, standing on unfamiliar ground, under the watchful eyes of armed men, most still clung to the belief, or at least the hope, that they had been brought here for work, for resettlement, for something survivable. It was a hope carefully nurtured by the camp's design, by the lies told at the point of departure, and by the absence of visible evidence of what lay ahead. The trains would come again the next day, and the day after that, each bringing its own cargo of humanity from another corner of occupied Europe. Their timetables were set not by the needs of the passengers, but by the pace of the killing. Each arrival was met with the same routine, the opening of the doors, the sorting, the herding onward. The railway became as much a part of the machinery of Treblinka as the gas chambers themselves, the iron rails carrying not just bodies, but the momentum of a system that could not and would not stop of its own accord. In the stillness, after a transport had been processed, the platform would fall silent again. The gravel would bear the imprint of countless feet, a dropped shoe, a scrap of paper, a child's mitten might lie unnoticed in the dust, small and mute traces of the lives that had passed through. Somewhere in the distance, another train would already be on its way. From the moment the train stopped at Treblinka's platform, the camp's greatest weapon, second only to its machinery of death, was deception. This was not the chaotic cruelty of a battlefield where fear and confusion reigned openly. This was a performance, rehearsed and perfected, where the actors were the guards, the stage was the camp itself, and the script was written to keep the newly arrived from knowing the truth until it was far too late to resist. The arrivals were told they were in a transit camp, a place to rest before being moved to labor assignments further east. Guards shouted orders in brisk, confident voices, as though there was work to be done and no time to waste. Men were told to line up separately from women and children. The division happened so quickly that it often felt like a natural step in an unfamiliar process, an administrative formality, not the permanent separation it truly was. The platform had small buildings, some painted and arranged to look like an ordinary railway stop. Sometimes a signboard bore the name of a station that did not exist. The guards played their roles well. Some even smiled faintly. A performance of normalcy. The Ukrainian auxiliaries, under the supervision of the German SS men, kept their weapons visible, but often carried themselves with a casual air, avoiding sudden movements that might raise alarm. The illusion was that this was all routine, that everyone was going somewhere else. After the initial separation, the men were sent down one path, the women and children down another. Each group was told to go to the undressing yard to prepare for a delosing and shower. The term delosing was familiar to many from the ghettos, where typhus and lice were common threats. Hearing it here could even offer a strange sense of relief. In the ghettos, delosing had been unpleasant but survivable. Hope, thin as it was, could cling to that memory. The undressing yard was an open space, enclosed by high wooden fences that blocked the view beyond. Prisoner labourers, themselves under strict guard, were stationed there to give instructions. They told the arrivals to neatly tie their shoes together, to place them in designated piles, to fold their clothes carefully. They said this would make it easier to find their belongings later, after the showers. The deception went deeper still. The prisoner workers, many of them Jewish themselves, sometimes spoke reassuringly, even offering to watch over a bag or an item of clothing until the person returned. It was not kindness, though some wished it could be, but survival for the prisoners who played their part, were kept alive only as long as they performed these duties. For the women and children, the undressing yard was often the place where their hair was cut, said to be for reasons of hygiene. In truth, it was harvested for industrial use, later shipped in bales to factories in Germany. The act itself was swift and impersonal, performed with shears that left the hair in uneven tufts. Few had time to question it. The pace was brisk and the guards were watchful. From the undressing yard, the prisoners were directed toward a narrow fenced pathway. This was the tube, a name given by the SS, half mocking, half practical. The tube was a long winding corridor, its high fences covered with freshly cut pine branches to block the view. At first glance, it might look like a path leading through a wooded area, perhaps toward another set of buildings. But the tube had only one destination: the gas chambers. The pathway was deliberately designed with curves, so that the chambers themselves were not visible until the very last moment. As people moved through it, they could see only the boards and branches on either side, the packed earth beneath their feet, and the backs of those walking ahead. The enclosure gave a sense of being channeled, of being in a process that could not be left. Along the tube, guards were stationed at intervals. They carried rifles or whips, but rarely needed to use them in those final moments. The deception had done its work. The pace was maintained briskly. The group kept moving forward without pause. Prisoner workers stationed along the route sometimes whispered a warning to those passing, a hurried phrase, a glance toward the sky. But these were rare, and even when heard, they were difficult to process in the shock of the moment. The deception was not only physical, but psychological. The absence of open violence at the start, the impression of order, the false promises of showers and work, all of it worked together to hold back panic until the victims were already at the threshold of the gas chambers. There, the reality would reveal itself in a rush, but by then there was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. For those forced to work in Treblinka, the Sonderkommando, the prisoners assigned to the most terrible duties, the tube was a place of haunting. They had seen its start and its end countless times, had watched thousands pass through, had heard the last conversations, the calls between family members, the quiet singing of mothers to calm their children. They knew that each group would vanish beyond that final corner, never to return. When the tube was empty, the stillness was almost unbearable. The pine branches swayed in the wind, the packed earth bore the marks of hurried footsteps. Somewhere far away, another train's whistle would sound, and the process would begin again. Treblinka's deception was not an afterthought. It was a central part of its function. Violence alone can provoke resistance. Deception disarms it. Here the lie was as deadly as the gas itself, and it was told not with words alone, but with an entire environment designed to make belief possible, just long enough for the machinery to do its work. The tube was in many ways the final chapter in the performance. Every detail along its length served a purpose. The screening branches, the bends in its path, the narrow width that made turning back nearly impossible. The construction was deliberate, not only to hide the chambers from view, but to block any visual cues from the rest of the camp. Those inside the tube could see nothing beyond the fence and the person walking ahead of them. Some survivors of Treblinka's revolt, who had been forced to work in the camp before escaping, later spoke of the strange calm that often marked these last moments. People still clutched small bundles, a jacket draped over an arm, a child carried in the crook of one arm, while the other held an older sibling's hand. The sound of boots on the earth, of murmured voices, sometimes of quiet prayers, filled the enclosed space. In rare instances, singing could be heard, not the triumphant kind, but soft, almost whispered, as though to soothe others or themselves. The guards did not usually need to hurry people along. The architecture of the place, the fences, the bends, the sense of being herded forward, did that work on its own. The deception was so complete that even at this stage, many still believed they were simply being moved to a place where a shower would take place. The very act of walking together in a group, rather than being violently driven, reinforced that illusion. For the prisoners in the Sonderkommando, who worked at the entrance to the gas chambers, this was the most unbearable duty. They were the last human faces the victims saw before the doors closed. Bound by the constant threat of their own deaths, they could offer no visible sign of what awaited. A glance, a pause, a murmured word of comfort, these tiny gestures were all they could risk, and even those could draw punishment from the guards. The tube ended abruptly in front of low, solid buildings. The chambers themselves had been disguised in a way that aligned with the larger deception. In earlier designs they were plain concrete, but later versions had false doorways, sometimes even painted to look like a tiled bathhouse. A simple sign might indicate bath or disinfection. The heavy airtight doors looked like industrial fittings rather than instruments of murder. In that final moment, as people stepped forward, some began to sense that the pieces of the story didn't fit together. The absence of running water pipes, the sharp commands from the guards, the sealed nature of the rooms, these things could stir a feeling of unease, but the transition from unease to recognition was short, and the space to react was non-existent. The genius and the horror of Treblinka's deception was that it bought minutes, sometimes only seconds, but those moments were enough to keep people from scattering, enough to prevent an organized rush against the guards, enough to allow the process to continue without interruption. After each transport, the tube would fall silent again. Prisoner workers would be sent in to clear any items left behind: a dropped scarf, a pair of shoes that had slipped loose, a child's wooden toy. The branches along the fence would be replaced regularly, kept fresh to maintain the illusion of a natural corridor. The earth of the pathway would be smoothed and packed again, erasing the footprints of those who had passed only minutes earlier. This routine repeated itself with an almost mechanical precision. A whistle from the railway yard would signal another arrival. The deception once again would begin at the platform, run its course in the undressing yard, and flow through the tube like water through a channel, ending always at the same place. Those who designed Treblinka understood something deeply unsettling about human psychology: that a well-crafted lie, supported by an environment that reinforces it, can carry people right to the edge of destruction without the need for force. Here, the lie was not just a cover for violence, it was an integral part of the violence itself. The deception killed just as surely as the gas, and when the camp was dismantled, the tube disappeared along with everything else. Its boards and branches were burned or reused, the earth was leveled, and the forest was allowed to reclaim the space. Today, in that quiet clearing, there is no physical trace of the winding path that once led so many to their deaths. Only the memories of those few who escaped carry its image: a narrow enclosed road through the pines and the silence, curving gently until it ended at the place where the truth could no longer be hidden. The path to the chambers was not long, but it was designed to feel endless. Prisoners who had already been stripped of their belongings, their hair, and their clothing were herded into a narrow, fenced passageway. The guards called the tube. It was a corridor of sand and dirt, hemmed in on both sides by high wooden fences interwoven with fresh pine branches, giving the illusion of something natural, almost pleasant, while hiding everything beyond. This concealment was not accidental. The pine boughs swayed in the summer wind, masking the barbed wire and preventing those inside the tube from glimpsing the next part of their fate until it was too late. Those who walked this path did so in varying states of mind. Some still clung to the fragments of the lie they had been told, that they were going to showers for disinfection before being given work and food. Others, noticing the strange silence that had replaced the bustle of the arrival platform, felt the first stirrings of dread. The guards, both SS men in their grey-green uniforms and the Ukrainian auxiliaries in their darker field clothes, kept the pace brisk. A whip crack, or the jab of a rifle butt, hurried those who hesitated. For the elderly, for parents holding their children close, for those struggling to walk without shoes, the journey became a blur of pushing bodies, sharp orders, and the sound of boots on the earth. As the column moved, there was a faint scent in the air, something that mingled diesel fumes with the sharper, sour undertone of decay. Few could place it, and few dared to speak of it aloud. But for those who had already seen too much, it was a confirmation. At the far end of the tube, through the gaps between the pine needles, a shape began to emerge. A low, rectangular building with a pitched roof, plain and unremarkable, its walls whitewashed and clean. No smoke rose from it, no shouting came from within. The stillness of it was its own form of menace. The building's facade gave no hint of its true function. A simple wooden door, wide enough for a group to pass through at once, stood at the center. Some versions of the building had flowers planted along the side or painted curtains on false windows, all to sustain the illusion. Near the entrance, a few guards stood at ease, one of them smoking, another leaning on his rifle. Their casual posture contrasted with the tension in the column, a deliberate show of control and inevitability. The people were ushered forward in small groups, their bare feet touching the cool concrete as they stepped inside. The chamber was brightly lit by electric bulbs fixed to the ceiling, their glare bouncing off the freshly whitewashed walls. The air inside at first felt cool compared to the summer heat outside, and the tiled floor was slightly damp as if it had recently been washed. All around there were shower heads fixed in neat rows along the ceiling. To an unknowing eye it was indeed a bathhouse, and for a few seconds some allowed themselves to believe it. Mothers spoke softly to their children, telling them it would be quick. A man asked another if there would be soap, but the more observant noticed details that didn't fit: the absence of drains where the water might escape, the faint metallic tang in the air, the strange heaviness of the atmosphere despite the coolness. And there was the door, thick reinforced wood with a heavy metal latch on the outside and no handle on the inside. The guards moved among them briskly, urging them to pack closer together. They wanted the space used efficiently, no wasted air. The chamber, though large enough to hold hundreds, seemed to shrink as the people were pressed in, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, until there was no room to move one's arms freely. The guards themselves never lingered inside for long. They stepped back toward the door, leaving behind the murmurs of questions, the occasional wail of a child, the rustle of bodies shifting in the confined space. Outside, the latch was tested, ensuring it slid firmly into place. The thick wooden bolt, reinforced with iron, closed with a sound that carried into the chamber, a deep final thud that seemed to still every voice for a moment. The electric bulbs continued to glow. For a few heartbeats, nothing happened. In that strange pause, people looked at each other, some expectantly, some with widening eyes as they began to sense that this was no ordinary room. From the other side of the wall came muted sounds, footsteps on gravel, a door opening and closing, the cough of an engine somewhere nearby. The sound grew louder, a deep mechanical rumble that made the walls seem to vibrate slightly. The air in the chamber felt suddenly heavier, harder to draw into the lungs. Someone near the back knocked on the wall. A woman called out in German, asking when the water would start. No answer came. The diesel engine, housed in a small shed connected to the chambers by sealed pipes, sputtered and coughed before settling into a steady growl. The operator, often a Ukrainian guard trained for this grim task, adjusted the controls to send the exhaust into the chamber. It was invisible, odorless at first, but it quickly began to change the air inside. Breaths became shallower, people shifted uneasily, and a few began to pound at the door. Outside, the guards stood smoking, their eyes on the building, but their expressions blank, as if what was happening within was of no consequence. The routine was familiar to them. It had been repeated countless times. Inside, the sound of pounding grew louder, accompanied by muffled cries. The air felt thick, as though it resisted being drawn into the lungs. The electric bulbs above glared on, indifferent. In those moments, the deception of the showers dissolved completely. And yet, even now, in the growing panic, there were those who tried to comfort the frightened mothers rocking their children, old men whispering prayers, friends holding hands. Human contact remained the last thread of dignity in a place designed to strip it away entirely. This was the threshold, the point of no return for those inside, and the point at which the machinery of Treblinka's core purpose came into full motion. Part 2 of this chapter will take us beyond the closing of the door and into the heart of the process, the aftermath, and the resetting of the chamber for the next transport. The pounding at the door began to weaken almost as soon as it had begun. At first it had been frantic, with fists, palms, and even shoulders slamming against the wood in desperation. Cries rose and overlapped. Shouts for help, for mercy, for God. The sound was muffled, as though coming from underwater, and to those outside, it was nothing more than a low, chaotic thrum beneath the steady growl of the diesel engine. Inside the chamber, the invisible poison was spreading quickly. It seeped into every breath, replacing the oxygen in the lungs with something deadly, something the body could not use. The victims did not know the science of it. They only knew that breathing had become a labor. The first signs were confusion and dizziness. Some swayed on their feet, clutching at those around them. Others gasped in short, sharp bursts, their mouths opening wide as if the air could be found if only they inhaled more deeply. But there was no relief. Panic, once it took hold, spread as swiftly as the fumes. People tried to push toward the door, creating a wave of pressure from the back of the chamber forward. Those in the front were crushed against the wood, their hands scraping at it until their fingernails broke or their skin tore. Others tried to climb, to rise above the mass of bodies in search of cleaner air, only to be pulled down again by the shifting, heaving crowd. Voices broke into coughing fits, harsh, dry, and violent. The children's cries turned into small, choking whimpers. The elderly, frailer in body, were often the first to fall, their legs giving way as the lack of oxygen reached their brains. Those who collapsed were instantly swallowed by the press of feet and knees, unable to rise again. Minutes passed. The engine continued its steady output, the rhythm of its pistons an unfeeling counterpoint to the human struggle within. In the darkness of their narrowing consciousness, some clung to memories, faces of loved ones, sounds of familiar streets, smells of home-cooked meals, as though anchoring themselves to the last fragments of life. Others prayed aloud, their voices slurring as the gas worked its way deeper into their lungs. The process, though, was rarely swift for everyone. The size of the chamber and the number of people packed inside meant that the concentration of exhaust reached lethal levels at slightly different rates, depending on where one stood. Those closest to the inlet vents succumbed sooner. Those near the far corners sometimes lingered longer, their movements slowing, their eyes glassy but still open, until finally, in small waves, the last signs of movement ceased. The guards outside knew when the chamber was ready. They had no clocks in their hands, but they had the repetition of practice. At Treblinka, this moment usually came between 20 and 30 minutes after the engine started, depending on the temperature and the condition of the victims. The operator would keep the engine running a little longer, just to be certain. Silence within was the signal. When at last the diesel was cut off, there was a moment of stillness around the building. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine. A faint odor, heavier now, clung to the walls and seeped into the open air. It was not the sharp scent of something burning. It was thicker, organic, and unclean. A guard stepped forward, without hesitation. The door was unbolted from the outside, the heavy latch sliding back with a rasp. As it swung open, a dense wave of heat and stench rushed out, striking the first men like a physical force. They turned their heads slightly, but did not step back. They were used to it. Inside, the sight was one they had seen countless times, bodies pressed together so tightly that even in death they stood almost upright, the weight of one holding another in place. Faces were frozen in expressions that told of pain, fear, or simply the final collapse of the body's will. The color of the skin had shifted in some, a bluish tinge to the lips and fingertips. Limbs were bent at odd angles from the press of the crowd. The The work of clearing began immediately. A team of Jewish prisoners, kept alive solely to perform this labor, stepped forward from their waiting area nearby. They moved quickly but carefully, their expressions blank, their hands methodical. They had learned to separate themselves from the reality of the task. To feel it fully was to risk breaking under the weight of it. First, the bodies at the front were pulled out, making space for the rest to be untangled. Often they came away in locked embraces, requiring the workers to pry apart fingers or cut through belts and straps. The floor, slick with condensation and other fluids, made the work dangerous. A misstep could send a man sprawling into the heap of the dead. The bodies were dragged toward a waiting cart or sled, depending on the season. In the early months of the camp, they had been buried in long, deep pits. Later, as orders from Berlin demanded the destruction of all evidence, they were taken directly to the open-air cremation grids, massive structures of railway tracks laid over concrete supports, where the corpses were burned on great pyres fed by wood and gasoline. The chamber itself was hosed down once it was empty. The walls, still damp from the condensation of many breaths, dripped onto the floor. The shower heads above gleamed in the electric light, waiting for the next group to arrive. The room was left to air for only a short while before the door was closed again, the space reset for another cycle. Outside on the platform, another transport had already been arriving, even as the last of the previous victims were being cleared away. The rhythm was unbroken. The deception, the herding, the sealing of the doors, it all repeated, day after day, in an unending loop. Treblinka was not a place of chance. It was a machine built for one purpose, and the gas chambers were its beating heart. The men who operated this machine knew the routine so well that they no longer needed to speak to each other much. Orders were given with gestures, glances, the tilt of a head toward the engine shed. They moved like workers on a factory floor, their product the annihilation of human lives. Yet, in the quiet moments, few as they were, some of the prisoner workers allowed themselves to notice the details. A small shoe left behind in a corner, a piece of cloth clenched in a lifeless hand, a strand of hair stuck to the damp tile wall. These fragments, meaningless to the guards, were, for the prisoners, silent memorials to the people they had been forced to process. They could not save them, but they could remember them in small, hidden ways. By the time the next group was marched down the tube, the chamber was once again clean, bright, and waiting. The cycle began anew, each repetition erasing the traces of the one before, until only the memories of those who had seen it firsthand could speak of what had taken place inside. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the pine branches along the tube, the heart of Treblinka continued its work, unseen by the world beyond the fences, hidden behind the whitewashed walls, and the silence that followed the closing of the heavy wooden door. The men who made up the Sonderkommando at Treblinka lived in a world balanced between death and survival. They were prisoners like the rest, yet separated from them by the smallest and most terrible distinction. They were kept alive only because their labor was essential to the functioning of the killing process. That labor was unlike anything else in the camp. It was intimate with the dead, constant in its contact with the evidence of murder, and it bound them to the machinery of destruction in a way that blurred every boundary of humanity. These men were chosen not for their strength of will, but for the strength of their bodies. The guards looked for those with sturdy frames and endurance, qualities that could withstand the physical demands of dragging, lifting, and carrying the dead day after day. When a new transport arrived, the selection was swift. Most were sent directly down the tube, but a handful might be pulled aside, marked for this special work. For those chosen, it meant a reprieve from immediate death, but at a cost so heavy that some wondered in their hearts if it was worth it. They slept apart from the other prisoners, in crude wooden barracks set close to the gas chambers and the cremation pits. The smell never left them. It clung to their clothes, their hair, even the skin under their nails. No amount of washing could erase it. At night, when the air cooled, the odors of the day, burnt flesh, damp earth, diesel exhaust, would seem to thicken, settling low to the ground, where it drifted into every breath. Each morning, before the first transport of the day arrived, they gathered their tools, hooks for pulling bodies from the piles, stretchers made of rough planks, buckets of water for rinsing the floors, and long poles for turning the burning remains on the pyres. These objects became extensions of their hands, the instruments through which their survival was negotiated. When the chamber doors opened, it was the Sonderkommando who stepped inside first. The guards would not touch the bodies, that work was beneath them, both in their own eyes and in the hierarchy of the camp. The prisoners moved with a grim efficiency, dragging the dead into the open air, lining them up so that valuables could be removed, rings, watches, gold teeth. Some carried shears for cutting hair, as the camp authorities demanded that even the dead be stripped of anything useful. The act of cutting the hair was its own kind of cruelty, for often it was done moments after death, the bodies still warm. The shorn hair was gathered, bagged, and stored for shipment to German factories, where it would be woven into cloth or used to stuff mattresses. Nothing was wasted, not even the most personal remnants of a human being. The men rarely spoke as they worked. Words seemed useless, too small against the weight of what surrounded them. The silence was broken only by the sound of dragging feet, the dull thuds of bodies hitting the ground, the hiss of water on the chamber floor. Over time, this quiet became a kind of shield. To speak too much, to notice too much, was to risk collapsing under the reality of it. Sometimes they recognized faces. A man might see a cousin, a neighbor from his childhood street, a teacher who had once praised his handwriting. There was no pause allowed for grief. The guards urged them on with shouts or blows, and the work continued. If a man faltered for too long, he was replaced, killed and replaced by another from the next arriving transport. This knowledge hung over every moment of their labor. Survival depended not only on strength, but on the ability to keep moving, keep lifting, keep one's eyes down. At the cremation sites, the air was hotter, the flames taller than a man. The fires roared day and night. Once the order came from Berlin to destroy all the burial pits. Bodies were stacked on the pyres with precision, alternating layers of wood and flesh so that the fire would catch evenly. Gasoline was poured from cans, splashing onto skin that blackened quickly under the heat. The men had to turn the bodies with their poles as they burned, ensuring that nothing remained unconsumed. The smell was indescribable, a thick, oily presence that coated the mouth and throat. The guards sometimes forced the Sonderkommando to sing as they worked, German marching songs, camp anthems, anything that might add a layer of mockery to the labor. The voices, cracked and low, carried over the crackle of the fire, a surreal counterpoint to the scene. The prisoners sang because refusal was not an option, and because sometimes a melody, however hollow, was the only thing that tethered them to the memory of life outside the camp. Food was meager, a piece of bread, a ladle of watery soup. It was enough to keep the body alive, though never enough to banish the constant hunger. Water was rationed, and on hot days, thirst gnawed at them, even as the sweat from the fires soaked their shirts. Sleep was shallow, broken by dreams that were not dreams at all, but replayed fragments of the day's work. Among the Sonderkommando, there was a bond of necessity. They looked out for one another when they could, sharing scraps of food, warning of a guard's foul mood. Yet there was also the knowledge that their lives were temporary. Sooner or later, the Germans would decide they had seen too much. Periodically, whole groups of the Sonderkommando were executed and replaced with new arrivals. This knowledge fostered a strange mix of solidarity and distance. They cared for one another, but they did not let themselves believe too strongly in the future. Occasionally, new prisoners in the Sonderkommando tried to speak of escape. The veterans listened in silence, knowing the odds, knowing the barbed wire, the guard towers, the patrols. Still, the thought lingered in the air, unspoken most of the time. If there was a chance to break free, to tell the world, someone must take it. For now, though, survival meant obedience, speed, and the ability to turn one's mind away from the weight of the dead. And every evening, as the fires dimmed and the embers glowed red under the night sky, the Sonderkommando returned to their barracks. They laid down in rows, the heat still in their bones, the smell still in their nostrils, their bodies aching from the endless lifting and dragging. Somewhere beyond the fence, the world turned as it always had, unaware of the labor that consumed them. And inside Treblinka, the burden of the Sonderkommando continued, one day into the next, as steady and merciless as the machinery of death itself. Night in Treblinka brought no true rest for the Sonderkommando. Even when the camp fell into a strange stillness, when the last of the day's transports had been processed, and the guards had retreated to their quarters, the quiet carried its own weight. It was not peace. It was the pause between storms. The prisoners lay on their bunks, their eyes fixed on the wooden beams above them, counting the seconds until sleep would claim them, if sleep came at all. And when it did, it brought with it visions that were far more vivid than dreams. Faces from the chambers, hands reaching out, voices they had never heard in life, but could now recall with an aching clarity. The nights were colder than the days, even in summer, and they pulled their thin blankets tightly around themselves. A few whispered to one another in the dark, their voices barely audible over the steady hum of the camp's generators. They spoke not of the past, for it was too painful, nor of the future, for it was too uncertain. Instead, they exchanged fragments of thought, small memories of food they had once eaten, music they had once heard, streets they had once walked. These scraps of the outside world were treasures, and for a moment, speaking them aloud was an act of quiet defiance against the world of Treblinka. Before dawn, the guards would come. Their boots on the gravel outside were the signal, sharp and unmistakable. Orders were shouted, and the Sonderkommando rose quickly, pulling on their clothes, stepping out into the grey morning air. They moved toward the gas chambers before the sun had fully risen, for the work had to be ready the moment the first transport arrived. The chamber floors were scrubbed down, the ashes were swept, and the pyres were stoked to life, so that they would be ready to receive the day's grim cargo. On some days, the trains came earlier than expected, their whistles cutting through the mist. The prisoners knew by now that each whistle meant hundreds more who would never leave Treblinka alive. They positioned themselves where the guards ordered, out of sight of the arriving deportees, but ready to begin the work as soon as the gas chamber doors opened again. The arrival of each transport was marked by the same terrible rhythm, the noise of the train slowing, the shouts of the guards, the barking of dogs, the cries of the people as they were herded from the cars. The Sonderkommando watched silently from their designated places. They were not permitted to interact with the new arrivals, and yet their eyes took in everything. The trembling of a child's hand in its mother's grasp, the confusion of the elderly as they tried to make sense of the scene. These moments were fleeting, gone the moment the crowd was pushed toward the tube, but they carved themselves into memory nonetheless. When the doors to the chambers opened after a gassing, the air that escaped was heavy and hot. The men stepped inside, their bodies already moving in practiced motions. They worked quickly to remove the bodies, for the chamber had to be ready for the next group. It was dangerous work in ways that were not always obvious. The heat, the lack of air circulation, the physical strain of lifting and carrying, all of it combined to sap their strength. The guards watched closely, urging them on with their rifles in hand, making sure the process never slowed. After the bodies were cleared, the task of searching them began. Every pocket, every seam of clothing, every mouth was examined for valuables. Rings were pulled from fingers, sometimes with force. Teeth were removed with pliers and dropped into metal containers that clinked with each addition. The prisoners worked without expression, their hands moving automatically, for to hesitate was to invite suspicion. At the cremation sites, the work was even more grueling. The pyres required constant attention to keep them burning evenly. Sometimes the wind shifted, sending the smoke and heat back toward the workers, stinging their eyes and skin. On wet days, the fire smoked heavily, and the prisoners had to add more fuel, breaking apart the charred remains to expose unburned sections. The smell was inescapable, clinging to everything. Even the guards, who stood farther back, could not escape it entirely. But for the Sonderkommando, it was an unending companion, following them even into their dreams. There were moments when the work took on an almost unreal quality, as if it were happening in a place outside of time. The prisoners moved through the motions with such practiced speed that it became difficult to remember a world where these tasks had not existed. The camp's schedule, the train arrivals, the orders of the guards, these had become the boundaries of their reality. And yet, deep within, each man carried the memory of his own life before Treblinka, a reminder that he had once been more than a pair of hands made to serve death. Rumors of resistance occasionally reached the Sonderkommando. They heard whispers from other prisoners, or saw small signs, an exchanged glance, a guard's sudden anger at a missing tool, the faint smell of smoke from somewhere it should not have been. These hints were fragile things, easily extinguished by the weight of fear, but for some they were sparks that refused to die out entirely. The thought that escape, however unlikely, might one day be possible, was enough to keep a small ember of hope alive. Still, the reality was that most days passed without incident, each one a mirror of the one before. The work was endless. The faces changed, but the process remained the same. The guards remained the same too, some indifferent, some openly cruel, all part of the same machine. The Sonderkommando learned to read their moods, to know which ones would strike without warning, which ones demanded more speed, which ones took a twisted pleasure in prolonging the prisoner's suffering. And so the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The faces of the dead blurred together in memory, though certain details would stand out without warning. A child's shoe, a strand of hair caught in a hand, a pair of glasses bent and broken on the floor. These images would surface later, in the quiet of the night, when the camp was still, and the only sound was the faint rustle of the wind through the wire. For the Sonderkommando, survival was a fragile balance. They lived with the knowledge that they could be replaced at any moment, that their usefulness was temporary, and yet in this balance they found ways to hold on, to share a crust of bread, to exchange a few words in their own language, to look out for one another when possible. These small acts did not change the reality of Treblinka, but they reminded the prisoners that they were still human, even in a place designed to strip humanity away. When the day's work was done, they returned to their barracks, their bodies aching, their clothes damp with sweat and smoke. They lay in the dark, listening to the faint crackle of the pyres still burning in the distance, the last echoes of the day's labor. In the silence, each man carried the weight of what he had seen, what he had done, and what he had endured. The burden was one that could not be shared fully, for no words could capture its depth, but it was a burden they bore together, bound by the cruel fate that had placed them in the heart of Treblinka's machinery of death. Treblinka's silence was deceptive. To a passerby who knew nothing of its purpose, the camp might have seemed like a collection of modest buildings in the middle of the Polish countryside, framed by forests and open fields. But to those within its fences, every plank of wood, every length of barbed wire, every line in the gravel path spoke of a single purpose, the industrialized ending of human lives. The camp was not a battlefield, not a place of chaos and disarray. It was, in its own horrific way, orderly, and that order was what made it so effective. At its heart, Treblinka was a machine, a complex, human-driven machine designed to process life into death with a terrifying efficiency. Unlike factories that manufactured goods, this factory consumed people. Every building, every gate, every pathway served a calculated role in a process that unfolded with the same grim rhythm, day after day. The machinery here was not steel gears or conveyor belts. It was the network of tracks, the chambers built of brick and concrete, the furnaces and the human beings, both prisoners and guards, who kept the system moving. The process began with the arrival of the trains. These trains were not ordinary passenger lines, though they sometimes carried the same kind of carriages. The cars were crowded far beyond their capacity, with people packed together so tightly they could barely move. The air inside was stifling, especially in summer, and many of the passengers had already begun to lose consciousness by the time the doors opened. For the camp's operators, the train station was the first gear in the machinery, a place where people were received and sorted, though never in ways that allowed for survival. The camp's rail spur led directly into a fenced-off unloading area. From the moment the train stopped, the guards took control of the process. Orders were shouted, dogs barked, and the disoriented passengers were herded down from the cars. In those first moments, the machinery of Treblinka was already at work. Its aim was not simply to move people, but to strip them of their bearings, to confuse them so completely that resistance seemed impossible. The path forward was carefully arranged. The tube, as it was called, was a narrow, high-fenced corridor that led from the unloading area to the gas chambers. It was designed to conceal its end from those who walked it. The fences were lined with branches and brush, giving the appearance of an enclosed path through the greenery. The deception was deliberate, ensuring that even as fear grew, there was no clear view of what lay ahead. At the same time, another part of the machinery worked in parallel, the sorting of belongings. While one group of prisoners was driven toward the chambers, others were directed to a side area where they were ordered to undress and leave their clothes neatly in piles. Valuables were collected separately: money, jewelry, documents, anything that could be of use to the Reich. This was a crucial part of Treblinka's operation, for the camp was not only a site of extermination, but also a source of material wealth for its overseers. Every item taken was another cog in the machine's wider purpose, profit extracted from the lives it destroyed. Inside the gas chamber complex, the machinery took its most brutal form. The chambers were built to resemble large bathing rooms, a deception reinforced by the presence of fake showerheads. Prisoners were told they would be deloused or disinfected, a lie that bought the operators the few minutes of compliance they needed. The doors were heavy, fitted with secure locks. Once the chamber was filled, the guards outside moved to the next stage, sealing the doors and starting the engines that would feed the lethal gas into the rooms. The machinery of death was not entirely mechanical. It depended on human hands, on the guards who operated the engines, on the prisoners forced to remove the bodies, on those who cleaned the chambers for the next group. In this way, the camp's efficiency was rooted not only in its physical design, but in the coerced labor of those it enslaved. The process was brutal but seamless, the output of one stage being the input of the next. Beyond the chambers, the machinery extended into the cremation grounds. At first, mass graves served as the final destination for the victims, but the work of exhuming and burning the bodies began later, driven by the need to hide the evidence of what had been done. This new stage required its own tools, grates of railway tracks to serve as pyres, fuel to feed the flames, and shovels and hooks to move the remains. Here too the process was unrelenting. The ashes were sifted to extract valuables, such as gold teeth, which were then added to the camp's stores. The guards oversaw every step, not only to enforce discipline, but to ensure that the machinery kept moving. In their eyes, delays were inefficiencies, and inefficiencies could not be tolerated. The prisoners learned to anticipate orders, to work without hesitation, because hesitation invited violence. The machinery demanded speed, and speed came at the cost of the prisoners' bodies and minds. What made Treblinka's machinery so terrible was its adaptability. It could operate in the heat of summer or the depths of winter. It could handle transports of hundreds or thousands. It could adjust its pace to the availability of trains, the demands from higher command, or the sudden need to conceal its activities. Its operators were not engineers in the traditional sense, but they understood their machine intimately, when to push it harder, when to slow it down, and how to keep it from breaking under its own strain. For the prisoners trapped within its workings, the machinery was inescapable. They were both part of it and consumed by it, their labor essential to its operation, their lives expendable when their usefulness ended. And as each day passed, the machinery ground on, erasing more lives, leaving behind only smoke and ash, and the faint, almost invisible traces that hinted at what had been done. The rhythm of Treblinka's machinery was not measured in hours or days, but in transports. Each arrival was like a signal that the process would begin again, and every element of the camp's operation fell into motion as if on cue. The railway siding filled with the groan of brakes, the whistle of steam, the shouts of the guards. For the people inside the cars, it was the end of a long and punishing journey. For the operators of the camp, it was the start of another cycle. Those who had been in the camp longer could read the signs. A sudden increase in guard activity meant that a transport was imminent. Prisoner laborers, those in the Sonderkommando forced to assist with the process, would be rushed into position. Some would be sent to the unloading platform, where they would help force the passengers off the cars. Others would move toward the undressing square, ready to collect the discarded clothing and items as soon as the order was given. The cycle was seamless, because those caught in it had no choice but to make it so. From the moment the train doors opened, the machinery began to separate the people from their last possessions. Luggage was tossed aside, children's toys were kicked into piles, and food parcels were left where they fell. These belongings would not be returned. Instead, they would be sorted, stored, and shipped away, part of the hidden economy that fed on the victims of the camp. The deception continued at every step. Families were told to remember where they had left their things, as if they would be returning for them after bathing. The gas chambers themselves, though central to the operation, were only one component in the larger apparatus. They were fed by a network of paths, guarded checkpoints, and tightly choreographed movements of people. The guards maintained strict control, ensuring that the chambers were never left idle for long. The priority was throughput, keeping the flow of victims steady, making sure that the killing process could be repeated with minimal interruption. The gassing procedure depended on diesel engines, installed in an adjacent room and operated by trained personnel. Once the victims were inside the chamber, The heavy doors were sealed, and the engine roared to life. The exhaust, rich in carbon monoxide, was piped directly into the sealed space. There was no soundproofing. Those outside could hear the muffled pounding on the walls, the cries that soon became weaker. The time it took for the process to end varied, depending on the temperature, the crowding, and the condition of the victims, but it was rarely less than 10 minutes. When silence fell, the machinery did not pause. The doors were opened, and the next team, the prisoner laborers assigned to remove the bodies, stepped in. They worked quickly, dragging the dead into the open air, laying them in rows for further processing. The air was heavy with fumes and heat, and the laborers were often weakened by the conditions, but the pace was relentless. The chambers had to be cleared, cleaned, and ready for the next group without delay. The machinery of Treblinka was not only physical but psychological. Its operators knew that fear, confusion, and deception were as effective as any wall or lock. By keeping the victims uncertain until the last moment, resistance was minimized. By forcing prisoners to participate in the process, they spread guilt and despair, making rebellion seem impossible. Even the landscape was part of the machinery. The fences, the camouflage of branches, the way the buildings were placed to hide one area from another. All of it was engineered to control perception and movement. As the months went on, the machinery was refined. The operators learned to handle larger transports, to shorten the time between arrivals, to deal with problems such as breakdowns in the engines or interruptions in the train schedule. When the mass graves began to fill, they introduced large-scale cremations. This required new structures, open-air pyres built from railway tracks, fuel and layers of bodies. The fires burned day and night, producing thick columns of smoke visible for miles. Every part of this process produced something of value for the perpetrators. The gold fillings pulled from the victims' mouths, the jewelry collected from the undressing square, the clothes and shoes that could be sent back to Germany. Even the ashes from the cremations were sifted for metal fragments before being scattered or buried. It was this combination of extermination and exploitation that made the machinery of Treblinka both efficient and utterly merciless. For those trapped within it, there was no point where the machinery stopped. It surrounded them at all times, in the barking of the dogs, in the sudden blare of a whistle, in the creak of a cart's wheels as it carried away the belongings of the dead. It consumed their labor until they were no longer able to work, at which point it consumed them as well. The machinery's fuel was human life, and its only product was death. And yet within the darkest hours, there were moments when the machinery faltered. A train might be delayed, a guard might be distracted, a minor breakdown in the engines might force a pause. In those moments, the prisoners could feel a brief and dangerous surge of hope. Though they knew it was fragile, the machinery was too vast, too entrenched to be stopped by chance alone. To halt it entirely would require something far greater, something that few in Treblinka dared to imagine while the process ground on. The human machinery of Treblinka was built from two distinct layers of authority: the German SS, who oversaw the camp's operations, and the auxiliary guards, often Ukrainian or Baltic, who carried out much of the physical enforcement. Together, they formed a web of control that touched every moment of life and death inside the fences. Each man had his place, his role, and his routines, and together they turned a patch of rural land into one of the deadliest places on earth. The SS officers were few in number, but their authority was absolute. They lived in a separate, more comfortable section of the camp, housed in wooden barracks or small houses that contrasted sharply with the prisoners' quarters. Their uniforms were clean, their boots were polished, and their weapons were well maintained. They moved with the assurance of men who knew they were untouchable. For them, Treblinka was both a posting and a task, a place where orders from Berlin were carried out with precision, and where their careers could advance through proven efficiency. Among the SS, there was a hierarchy, even within this small world. The commandant, often seen inspecting the grounds or meeting with his subordinates, set the tone. Beneath him were officers in charge of specific areas: the arrival platform, the undressing square, the gas chambers, the cremation grounds. Each officer had his own methods, his own temperament. Some were coldly bureaucratic, speaking little to the prisoners except to give orders. Others were openly brutal, making examples of anyone who failed to move quickly enough, or who dared to look them in the eye. The Ukrainian and Baltic guards, the Trawniki men, were the visible enforcers. Dressed in a mixture of German and locally supplied uniforms, they were armed with rifles and pistols, sometimes with clubs or whips. They stood at key points along the prisoner routes, their eyes scanning constantly for hesitation or disobedience. Many had been recruited from prisoner of war camps, given a choice between starving behind barbed wire or serving in the camps. Whatever their reasons for joining, by the time they were at Treblinka, most had learnt the rules, follow orders without question, and cruelty was not only permitted, but often rewarded. These men became the moving parts of the camp's daily cycle. At dawn, they were already at their posts. They manned the gates, guarded the perimeters, and patrolled the areas where the prisoners worked. On transport days, their shouts and gunfire drove people from the train cars, pushing them down the narrow path toward the square. Their presence created a constant tension. Every prisoner knew that a glance, a stumble, or even a moment of slowing could bring a rifle butt to the ribs, or a shot to the back. Inside the SS compound, life for the staff was marked by a strange duality. They could drink coffee in the morning, eat meals prepared by prisoner cooks, and play cards in the evening. And yet, just beyond the fence, hundreds or thousands of people were dying each day under their orders. Some seemed able to separate these two realities completely, treating the camp as a workplace that just happened to deal in human lives. Others carried the violence with them, using it as a form of entertainment, staging beatings or mock games with the prisoners that ended in bloodshed. The camp staff did not work in isolation. There was constant communication with the railway authorities, with higher SS offices, with the supply depots that sent in fuel, ammunition, and the personal goods taken from the victims. Reports were sent back to headquarters, recording the numbers of arrivals, the efficiency of the process, and the quantities of goods collected. Even in death, the victims were accounted for in a way that turned them into statistics on paper. Prisoners who had to deal directly with the staff, whether as cooks, tailors, mechanics, or other assigned roles, saw both faces of their captors. They might receive a casual word from an officer one moment, and the next be struck for no reason at all. These interactions were unpredictable, and so the safest approach was to remain silent, move quickly, and avoid notice. Yet, even in this careful dance, there were moments when the prisoners glimpsed the human under the uniform, a guard humming a song from home, an officer distracted by a letter, a brief flash of hesitation before an act of violence. But such moments never lasted. The staff understood their role in the machinery of Treblinka, and they fulfilled it without interruption. Each man's part was small in isolation, but together they formed a system that worked with a deadly efficiency. Orders moved down the chain of command, and bodies moved through the gates, the squares, and the chambers in response. No one man built Treblinka's reputation as a place from which no one returned. It was the combined effort of all those in uniform, working together in a place designed for killing. Even in this carefully managed structure, tension sometimes surfaced. Disputes over procedure, arguments about discipline, or complaints about supplies could cause friction among the staff. These were resolved quietly, usually in meetings out of sight of the prisoners. The smooth running of the camp was the priority, and any disagreements that might threaten it were quickly suppressed. To the prisoners, these inner workings were invisible. All they saw was the unbroken wall of authority that surrounded them. The staff's confidence in their position was reinforced by the isolation of Treblinka itself. Far from major towns, hidden by forests and rural land, they could act without fear of outside interference. They were the law within the fences, and beyond those fences lay only distance and secrecy. This isolation allowed them to maintain the illusion that what they did here was part of a separate world, disconnected from ordinary life. In that illusion, they found the freedom to act with a cruelty that had no limits. At the heart of Treblinka's operations was a strict rhythm. The staff lived and worked according to a timetable shaped by the arrival of the trains. A quiet morning could turn into frantic activity within minutes, as the distant whistle signaled another transport. The commandant would be informed, orders would be relayed, and the guards would be summoned to their posts. Conversations would end, coffee cups would be set down, and the camp's machinery would spring into motion. In these moments, the staff operated almost like a single organism, each member moving to his place in the sequence that would funnel thousands of people toward the gas chambers before nightfall. The SS officers, though fewer in number, carried an air of command that went beyond their uniforms. They were the ones who decided how quickly a transport would be processed, how many prisoners might be kept back for labor, and how discipline would be maintained that day. Some walked with a deliberate calm, observing the process like the overseers of a factory line, noting any delays or disruptions. Others barked orders constantly, their voices cutting through the din of shouts, crying children, and clanging doors. The Ukrainian and Baltic guards mirrored these attitudes. Those under a harsh officer became harsher themselves. Those under a quieter commandant moved with a cold efficiency, doing their work without much noise, but with no less brutality. In their quarters, the staff kept personal belongings, photographs from home, radios, newspapers, and trinkets taken from the victims. Watches, rings, fine pens, objects stripped from those who arrived were often sorted in the storehouses, but certain items never made it that far. A guard might pocket a piece of jewelry, an officer a set of silver cufflinks, a rare coin, or a fountain pen with a gold trim. These were tokens of possession, and in the twisted morality of the camp, they were not seen as theft, but as perks of service. There were moments of celebration within the SS compound: birthdays, promotions, holidays. Prisoners working in the kitchen were ordered to prepare special meals, roasted meats, pastries, bottles of schnapps, brought in from nearby towns. The staff laughed and toasted each other, the sound of music sometimes drifting into the prisoner areas, where the contrast between the festivity and the suffering was sharp and bitter. The same men who raised their glasses in the evening would be standing at the unloading platform the next morning, driving the newly arrived toward their deaths without a pause. For those assigned to the gas chambers and the cremation areas, the psychological landscape was different. These men were in constant contact with death on a scale that defied comprehension. Their tasks were both mechanical and horrific, ensuring the chambers were sealed, checking that the engine was running properly, ordering prisoners to remove the bodies, and managing the disposal process. Some grew hardened to it quickly, their manner detached, their minds perhaps numbed by repetition. Others coped through aggression, taking out whatever unease they felt by mistreating the prisoners under their authority. There were also those who relied on alcohol to dull their senses, drinking heavily in the evenings to forget, or perhaps to avoid thinking at all. Prisoners who served in the Sonderkommando, forced to work in these areas, sometimes observed small cracks in the staff's armor. An officer might avoid looking directly at the victims as they entered the chambers, or a guard might mutter to himself while lighting a cigarette, standing with his back to the scene. But these glimpses were rare and fleeting. The system demanded that personal feelings be buried under obedience and efficiency. Any sign of hesitation could be seen as weakness, and weakness was dangerous among men whose positions relied on proving their toughness to their peers and superiors. Treblinka's staff also maintained strict discipline among themselves. Infractions could be punished, though rarely with the severity shown to the prisoners. A guard who drank too much while on duty, or an officer whose negligence caused a delay in the processing, might be reprimanded or temporarily reassigned. The goal was always to maintain the smooth flow of operations. Personal issues were tolerated only if they did not interfere with the timetable. The Ukrainian and Baltic guards were not merely subordinates. They were essential. Without their constant presence at key points, the SS officers could not have managed the sheer scale of Treblinka's operations. These auxiliaries were the ones who moved the prisoners from one area to another, who stood watch at the undressing square, who escorted the work details, who patrolled the perimeter day and night. Their relationship with the SS was one of both dependence and hierarchy. They had authority over the prisoners, but remained subordinate to the Germans. That dynamic could create tensions, especially when a guard's brutality drew unwanted attention, or when personal disputes spilled over into the day's work. Despite these undercurrents, the staff functioned with a unity of purpose. They were bound together by the isolation of the camp, the secrecy of its mission, and the shared belief, or at least acceptance, that what happened here was necessary and justified. Whether through conviction, careerism, fear, or simply the momentum of obedience, each man played his role without open challenge. This cohesion was reinforced by the physical environment, the SS compound, the guard barracks, the work areas. All were enclosed within a world that revolved around Treblinka's single function. There were no townspeople wandering in, no casual visitors, no unexpected inspections from outsiders. The only new faces were those arriving on the trains, and they never stayed long enough to disrupt the established order. Within this closed system, the staff could operate without interference, and that sense of unassailable control gave them a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Yet, beneath the surface, the staff were not invulnerable. Rumors circulated about partisan activity in the forests, about escapes from other camps, about advances on the front lines. Such whispers were often dismissed, but they could not be entirely silenced. For now the daily routine continued. The trains arrived, the orders were given, the tasks were carried out, and by nightfall, the ground of Treblinka held the weight of another day's work. To the prisoners, the staff were the face of the camp's power, a constant reminder that here within the fences there was no appeal, no justice, and no mercy. To the staff themselves, they were colleagues, bound by a shared assignment, each man performing his duties under the same sun, breathing the same air, heavy with smoke and the unspoken knowledge of what their work meant. Together they sustained the machinery of death, and in doing so they ensured that Treblinka remained, for as long as it stood, a place from which almost no one returned. The trains that approached Treblinka were heavy with human expectation, though few on board could have described exactly what they expected. They had been told they were being resettled, moved to a new home where work awaited them, where food would be available, where life, though different, could continue. It was a fragile hope, born partly of necessity and partly of the human instinct to believe that the worst will not happen to oneself. The deception that waited for them at the camp was built on this fragile hope, nourished it and used it to keep the machinery of death running without interruption. From the moment the transport doors were thrown open, the choreography began. The Ukrainian guards barked orders, their rifles slung over their shoulders, while SS officers moved among the prisoners with an air of brisk authority. For those stepping down from the train, the first sight of Treblinka was not of barbed wire and watchtowers, though those were there beyond the periphery, but of a space arranged to resemble something more familiar, something that felt temporary, transitional. The arrival area was deliberately structured to mimic a small rural train station. A wooden building stood to one side, painted and labelled as if it were an administrative office. There were benches placed nearby, the kind one might expect to find where passengers waited for connecting trains. A signboard hung in view, suggesting schedules or information. The platform itself had been built with enough attention to detail that someone stepping down from the train might not immediately register that they were inside a closed camp. This illusion was the first and most critical step in Treblinka's deception. The camp was not fortified in the way a prison might be at its front. Instead, it wore a mask. That mask was not meant to withstand deep scrutiny, only to last long enough to funnel thousands of people through the process without panic. Most who arrived were exhausted, thirsty, and confused by the journey. The human mind, under such strain, clings to anything familiar: a signpost, a bench, the presence of uniformed men who seem to be directing people efficiently. These could be enough to convince someone that this was indeed a transit point, and nothing more sinister. The SS understood this psychology intimately. They had learned from earlier experiments in places like Belgique and Sobibor that fear could create chaos, and chaos could slow the process. Panic meant prisoners scattering, fighting, and refusing to comply, and that meant delays, injuries among the guards, and an overall reduction in efficiency. Deception, on the other hand, smoothed the flow. A calm crowd could be moved quickly. A compliant group could be stripped, herded, and killed in less time than it would take to quell a riot. In the early days of Treblinka, the deception was crude but effective. As time passed, it became more elaborate. A wooden structure was erected to resemble a ticket office, complete with a window and a counter. Painted boards suggested destinations and prices. Though no one actually bought a ticket here, its presence reinforced the idea that this was a place of travel, a station on a journey rather than the end of the line. Nearby, flower boxes were installed, brightening the space and softening the hard lines of the fences. Prisoners, forced to tend these flowers, worked quickly under guard, arranging the blooms in neat rows. It was an odd, unsettling beauty, but to those arriving, it might have been interpreted as a sign of order and normalcy. Alongside these visual tricks came a carefully orchestrated sequence of instructions. Officers addressed the arrivals briskly, telling them that they would be taken to a bathhouse for disinfection before continuing their journey. This explanation served multiple purposes. It accounted for the next steps they would take, it justified the separation of men from women and children, and it explained why they would need to remove their clothing. Hygiene was a believable pretext, especially in an era when typhus outbreaks were a genuine threat, and travelers were sometimes subjected to delousing procedures. Prisoners selected for labor within the camp were sometimes told to join a different line, under the same explanation that they were needed temporarily to assist with maintenance, unloading supplies, or construction before continuing on. This selective truth-telling, offering details that were plausible but incomplete, was another layer of the deception. Those chosen for labor might survive for weeks or months, but the belief that they were merely working toward an eventual release kept them compliant. For the SS and the guards, maintaining the illusion required discipline. They could not afford to reveal the truth too soon. Even small details were managed. The path from the platform to the undressing square was screened by high fences covered in branches, blocking the view of the gas chambers. The smell of smoke and decay that hung over the camp was masked, when possible, by the burning of fresh pine branches in certain areas, giving the air a scent that could be mistaken for wood fires. The deception extended to the sounds of the camp. In some cases, music was played, recorded marches or popular songs, either from a gramophone near the arrival area, or by prisoner orchestras forced to perform. The upbeat tunes, incongruous in such a place, were meant to soothe and distract. They created a soundscape that suggested activity and routine rather than death and despair. Even the uniforms played a role in the charade. The SS wore their standard black or field grey attire, projecting authority but not necessarily signaling immediate danger to civilians unfamiliar with military ranks. The Ukrainian guards in their mismatched uniforms could be mistaken for railway or auxiliary police by those who had not yet encountered them in the ghettos. The appearance of officialdom lent credibility to the story being told that these were transport personnel managing the movement of people, not executioners overseeing a killing ground. For those who hesitated, who asked questions or seemed suspicious, the SS had prepared answers. Questions about luggage were met with reassurances. The belongings would be disinfected and sent on after the transport. Concerns about separation from family members were soothed with promises that they would be reunited after bathing. The aim was always to maintain forward motion, no long conversations, no room for doubt to spread through the crowd. In this carefully staged environment, deception did not just hide the reality of Treblinka, it enabled it. The mask worn at the front of the camp was not an afterthought or a courtesy. It was a weapon as essential as any rifle or pistol. It was the silent partner to the violence that followed, ensuring that the victims arrived at the gas chambers as calmly and swiftly as possible. And so, day after day, the same ritual repeated. The train doors opened, the platform filled with the shuffle of feet and the murmur of weary voices. The station facade stood ready, its flowers tended, its benches straightened, its signs in place. The officers called out their instructions, the guards herded the arrivals into their lines, and the path into the camp swallowed them, one group at a time. To those who arrived, it seemed like a place they would pass through. To those who worked there, it was the place where journeys ended forever. Once the arrivals had been shepherded away from the train, the second act of the performance began. The facade of the station faded behind them, though its psychological influence remained. They were led into a wide, open square within the camp's inner perimeter, a space deliberately designed for the next stage of the deception. This was the undressing square, but the arrivals did not know it by that name. Here, under the gaze of armed guards, the SS officers continued their charade. Men were separated from women and children, often under the explanation that the processing would be faster if they went in different groups. The division was swift, mechanical, and final. Some resisted, clinging to their loved ones, but the guards moved in with curt orders and the butt of a rifle to pry them apart. Mothers and fathers promised their children they would see each other after the bath. The guards did nothing to correct them. Instructions were barked in a tone that was brisk but not openly brutal. At least not yet. The prisoners were told to remove their clothes and place them neatly in designated piles. Shoes here, coats there, valuables in a separate container. This part of the process was presented as a matter of hygiene and order, reinforcing the idea of a bathhouse ahead. Luggage was tagged, or at least pretended to be, giving the impression that it would follow them. In reality, all these belongings would be sorted by prisoners in the Goldjuden Commando and sent back to Germany or redistributed among the camp staff. For many, this stripping of possessions and clothing was the moment when the first real doubts began to form. There was something humiliating, something unnatural about being ordered to stand naked among strangers. Some shivered in the air. Others tried to cover themselves with their arms. The guards, however, kept the process moving, shouting orders, clapping their hands, and motioning for speed. Those who hesitated or protested were dealt with quickly. A slap, a blow from a rifle butt, or a pistol raised in warning was often enough to silence them. Sometimes a shot rang out, a sharp, unmistakable reminder that compliance was not optional. The body of the one who had resisted might be dragged away without comment, the others forced to look away. Once undressed, the prisoners were given the order to proceed toward the bathhouse. This was the heart of the deception. A narrow, fenced-in pathway that led from the square deeper into the camp. The fences on either side were woven thickly with branches and pine boughs, so that nothing beyond could be seen. The path was known by the camp staff as the Schlauch, the tube. It twisted slightly, preventing the arrivals from seeing too far ahead, and its enclosed walls heightened the sense of being guided toward a specific destination. At the far end of the tube stood a low building with a door. It did not look like a gas chamber to the uninitiated. There were no chimneys, no visible machinery, no signs of the horror inside. In some cases, a Star of David was painted above the entrance, as if to suggest that this was a communal facility for Jews, perhaps a synagogue or a cultural center. This detail varied over time, but when it was present, it served as one more psychological hook to keep suspicion at bay. As they approached, the guards maintained the illusion. Schnell, schnell, they called, not with the urgency of a battlefield, but with the briskness of a work supervisor. Prisoners were told to remember where they had placed their clothes so they could collect them afterward. Some were instructed to tie their shoes together to avoid losing one. Others were told to leave their documents and money with the guards for safekeeping. Each instruction reinforced the idea that they would be returning. Inside the undressing square, meanwhile, the machinery of death was already in motion. As soon as one group had moved down the Schlock, another transport's passengers were unloaded from the train. The square was in constant use, the piles of clothing growing and then vanishing as the work details carted them away. Nothing was wasted, not even the hair from the victims' heads. Prisoners forced into this work had to move among the discarded garments, searching for valuables, sorting fabrics, and bundling shoes. It was labor carried out under the watchful eyes of the guards, labor that could never be refused. Those inside the tube could hear the muffled sounds of the camp, the barking of dogs, the shouting of guards, the shuffle of feet behind and ahead of them. If the wind shifted, they might catch an unfamiliar, acrid smell on the air, but most would not recognize it for what it was. And if any voice whispered a warning, it was drowned in the forward momentum of the crowd, the physical press of bodies moving toward the building. At the door to the so-called bathhouse, a figure sometimes greeted them, an SS man or a Ukrainian guard, perhaps even wearing a white coat, like a sanitary worker. This was a deliberate choice, a theatrical detail meant to make the deception complete. They might be told to enter quickly, to breathe deeply once inside for the disinfection. The white coat, the confident tone, the small gestures of authority, these played on the natural human tendency to trust those who appear to be in charge of a controlled medical process. The moment they stepped inside, the truth closed in around them. The room resembled a communal shower, with shower heads fixed to the ceiling. The space was windowless, the walls bare, the doors were shut behind them, sealed. At first there was confusion. Some waited for the water to flow, Others called out to the guards, but the only thing that descended was death, carried on the invisible air. The SS men operating the chambers did not remain inside. They stood outside, in an adjacent room, controlling the flow of carbon monoxide gas from engines connected by pipes to the chamber. The victims' screams, pounding and cries grew desperate, then weakened, then ceased. The deception had done its work. There had been no riot, no mass attempt to break free. The victims had walked into their own execution, believing until the last moments that they were being taken to a bath. When the gas chamber doors were finally opened, the scene was grim beyond words. Bodies lay tangled, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, their hands clawing at the walls and at each other. The work of removing them fell to the prisoners assigned to the Sonderkommando, men who knew that their own lives were measured in weeks, that they too would one day walk the Schlau. They dragged the bodies out, stripped them of any remaining valuables, cut the hair from the women's heads, and prepared them for burial or cremation. Back in the arrival area, the process was already beginning again. Another train had pulled in. Another crowd was stepping down onto the platform, their eyes scanning the station facade, their ears catching the promises of the officers. The cycle repeated itself with a chilling efficiency, day after day, week after week, until hundreds of thousands had been consumed by it. The deception was not a small detail of Treblinka. It was its very engine. Without it, the camp could not have killed at the speed it did. Without it, there would have been resistance, chaos, and the kind of disorder that slowed the machinery of genocide. The station, the flowers, the ticket office, the instructions about bathing, all of it was a mask, one that hid a face too monstrous to look upon, until it was too late. And as the victims' possessions were packed into crates, their clothes bundled for shipment, their bodies buried or burned, the mask was straightened and set in place again, ready for the next train. For more than a year, Treblinka had operated like a perfect machine. The deception was polished, the transports arrived on schedule, and the killing process was fast and uninterrupted. But the machine had one flaw. It relied on human beings to keep it running. Human beings who, even under the crushing weight of terror, still harbored the smallest embers of hope and defiance. Among the Sonderkommando prisoners and the labor details, whispers of escape had circulated almost from the beginning. They knew their fate. The average life expectancy for a prisoner working inside the extermination area was measured in weeks. Some had seen the fate of their predecessors, the sudden disappearances, the executions, the silent, empty bunks. The work they did made them witnesses to every stage of the killing process, and with that knowledge came the certainty that there would be no natural survival. If they were to live, they would have to take the risk themselves. But escape was nearly impossible. The camp was surrounded by high fences of barbed wire, some sections double-layered, with the inner fence woven with pine branches to block the view. Guard towers stood at the corners, manned by SS and Ukrainian guards, armed with rifles and machine guns. Patrols with dogs roamed the perimeter. Even if one could slip out, the surrounding countryside was hostile and watched. And yet the thought persisted. Perhaps because to abandon it entirely would be to accept death without even the dignity of trying. The idea of an uprising was first spoken in guarded tones between a few trusted men. These were not the broken, newly arrived prisoners who still hoped for mercy. They were the veterans of the camp, men who had been kept alive for months because their skills were too useful to discard. They knew the routines, the strengths and weaknesses of the guards, the schedule of the trains. They also knew the locations of the camp's hidden stores, especially the armory where rifles, pistols and grenades were kept. One of the key figures was Dr. Julian Trawniki, a former Polish army officer, and doctor who served in the camp's infirmary. His position allowed him a degree of mobility within the camp, and occasional contact with others outside the most heavily guarded zones. Trawniki began quietly reaching out to men he believed could be trusted, testing their resolve with vague hints before revealing more concrete plans. His idea was not just escape, it was sabotage. If they could kill the guards, destroy the killing installations, and ignite the camp's ammunition stores, Treblinka could be crippled forever. But the risks were immense. The SS were quick to detect signs of conspiracy. Informants existed among the prisoners, either coerced by threats or lured by promises of small privileges. A careless word, a hint of unusual movement, could bring disaster. Trawniki himself fell victim to this danger. In early 1943, the SS became aware of his activities. Faced with imminent arrest and torture, he swallowed poison, choosing death on his own terms, rather than betraying his comrades. His death was a blow to the plot, but it did not end it. Leadership passed to others, among them a man named Zelo Bloch and another known as Galuski, a former Jewish officer from Warsaw. They reorganized the plan, knowing now that time was against them. Every day brought new arrivals, and with them, new executions. Every week more of their trusted men disappeared. The conspiracy was divided into cells, so that if one group was discovered, the others could still continue. Communication between them was carried out in snatches, brief exchanges while hauling goods, whispered words while bent over tools. The men studied the routines of the guards, noting who was lazy, who could be bribed with stolen valuables, and who always followed a strict pattern of patrols. They watched the gates, the positions of the sentries, the timing of the train arrivals. The plan took shape in several phases. First, weapons had to be secured. This was the most dangerous step, as the armory was locked and guarded. But there were moments when tools could be stolen, when doors could be forced with improvised picks, when a sympathetic or careless Ukrainian guard could be distracted. A key was secretly made to the armory, its creation a feat of both craftsmanship and nerve. Next, the prisoners needed to coordinate their timing. A revolt had to be sudden, overwhelming, and simultaneous across the camp. The guards in the towers had to be neutralized immediately, and the command center seized before an alarm could be raised. The ammunition dump had to be reached quickly and set on fire or detonated to prevent the SS from regrouping. But above all, the revolt had to be launched on a day when no train was due to arrive. If thousands of new prisoners were suddenly on the grounds, the chaos would be uncontrollable, too many innocents would be caught in the crossfire, and the uprising could be crushed before it even began. By midsummer of 1943, the plan was ready. The chosen day was August 2nd, a hot afternoon when the SS officers would be less inclined to linger in the sun, and when no new transport was expected until the following morning. That morning, the prisoners went about their assigned work as usual, though inside their nerves were taut. Small acts were carried out in preparation. One group, tasked with cutting wood near the camp fence, loosened the soil beneath the barbed wire in a hidden spot, making it easier to crawl under when the moment came. Another group positioned themselves near the workshop, where they could retrieve hidden weapons. Keys and stolen grenades were passed from hand to hand, concealed in pockets or under rags. The sun climbed higher. The guards moved about lazily, some lingering in the shade, others drinking from their canteens. From the kitchen, the smell of boiling potatoes drifted on the air. A deceptive calm lay over Treblinka, one of those still moments before a storm, when the air feels thick and heavy, as though holding its breath. Then, sometime in the early afternoon, the first move was made. A small group entered the armory, under the pretense of performing repairs. The stolen key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside, racks of rifles gleamed in the dim light. They moved quickly, stuffing pistols into their belts, slinging rifles over their shoulders, and tucking grenades into sacks. Each man knew that the moment they left this building, there would be no going back. Outside, other prisoners began their own parts of the plan. Fires were set in the storage sheds to draw the attention of the guards and create confusion. In the machine shop, a grenade was prepared to be hurled at the nearest tower. The cry of a warning bird, one of the agreed-upon signals, cut through the camp air. It was the sound they had been waiting for. What came next would erupt into chaos, gunfire, and a desperate race for survival. The sound of the signal was still hanging in the air when the first shot cracked through the camp. It was not the cautious, isolated sound of a guard firing at a fleeing prisoner. It was sharp, urgent, the beginning of a chain reaction. In an instant, Treblinka's unnatural calm was torn apart. Prisoners dropped their tools and ran toward their assigned positions. Men who had hidden weapons pulled them free, the glint of steel and the weight of cold metal in their hands giving them a jolt of both fear and determination. From the armory, the group emerged, armed and tense. They had taken as much as they could carry, rifles slung over their shoulders, pistols clenched in their fists, grenades cradled in rough cloth sacks. The air seemed to thicken, filled with the pounding of feet, the shouted orders of the guards, and the barking of dogs sensing the break in the daily rhythm. One prisoner, his hands shaking but steady enough to aim, raised a rifle toward the nearest guard tower. The shot hit true, and the figure inside the tower slumped. Almost immediately, another guard in a neighboring tower swung his machine gun toward the sound, and a stream of bullets tore into the ground below, throwing up dirt and splinters. But now the uprising was in motion, and the momentum could not be reversed. Grenades exploded near the vehicle garage, sending a rush of smoke billowing across the camp. The smell of gunpowder and burning wood filled the air, stinging the eyes and throats. Prisoners surged toward the perimeter fences, their movements frantic but purposeful. Some carried axes or crowbars, hacking at the posts and the wire. Others used their bare hands to pull at the barbed strands, ignoring the tearing of their skin. Inside the main yard, the guards were caught off guard, some still trying to understand the scale of what was happening. The conspirators moved with the desperate clarity of men who had spent months imagining this moment. Targets were chosen quickly, those with the keys to the gates, those manning the heavy weapons, those who could radio for reinforcements. Every second counted. The storage shed went up in flames, its roof collapsing inward with a roar. The fire spread quickly, fed by the dry summer air and the fuel-soaked wood. This was part of the plan, smoke to blind the guards, to obscure the movements of those making for the fences. But it also added to the chaos, making it harder for the prisoners to see each other, harder to find the gaps they had prepared. Some of the Ukrainian guards, unprepared for such an assault, fled outright. Others fired wildly into the crowd, cutting down both the fleeing prisoners and their fellow captives who had not yet understood what was happening. The SS officers were harder to overcome. They regrouped quickly, rallying the remaining guards and moving to seal the camp's main exits. Near the workshops, a fierce skirmish broke out. Prisoners with pistols exchanged fire with the guards, each shot echoing off the wooden walls. A man fell, clutching his side, and another took his weapon without breaking his stride. Blood streaked the packed dirt, but the attackers pressed on. They were no longer thinking of survival as a distant hope. It was now or never. The section of the fence where the soil had been loosened earlier was now the focus of a frantic effort. Men tore at it, pulling the bottom strands upward to create a space just wide enough to crawl through. Some dove under, emerging on the other side and sprinting toward the tree line beyond. Others were caught in the wire, their clothing or flesh snagged, becoming easy targets for the gunfire. The sounds of the uprising were overwhelming, a blend of shouted commands in German, Polish, and Yiddish, the crack of rifles and the stuttering bursts of machine guns, the screams of the wounded, the roar of the flames. In this confusion, small groups formed and broke apart, each seeking its own path to freedom. Those who made it beyond defense faced new dangers. The fields around Treblinka offered little cover, and the guards with their rifles in the towers could still pick off the fleeing figures. But the forest lay ahead, a dark, dense line of safety, if they could just reach it. Men ran with every scrap of strength left in them, some barefoot, some clutching stolen weapons, some carrying others who had been wounded. In the camp's inner sections, the revolt was still raging. Fires had reached the area where gasoline was stored, and the resulting explosion shook the ground, sending a column of black smoke into the sky. The blast startled even the most hardened guards, creating a momentary lull in the gunfire. Prisoners used it to break from cover and make for the perimeter, but not everyone could leave. Many of those assigned to the most heavily guarded parts of the camp, near the gas chambers themselves, were trapped. For them, escape was impossible. Instead, they fought where they stood, attacking the guards with whatever they had, tools, stones, even their bare fists. Their resistance was as much about defiance as it was about survival, a refusal to die without striking back. By late afternoon, the uprising was losing its initial momentum. The element of surprise had given way to a brutal counterattack. The SS, furious and ruthless, began methodically hunting down the remaining pockets of resistance inside the camp. Machine guns swept across the open ground, cutting down anyone still moving. The fires still burned, but they were no longer spreading. The flames had consumed what they could, leaving charred wreckage behind. Out of the roughly 700 prisoners in Treblinka at the time, around 300 managed to breach the fences and make for the forest. But the escape was far from over. The countryside was swarming with patrols, and local collaborators were eager to turn in the fugitives for rewards. Many were recaptured or killed in the days that followed. In the end, only about 70 would survive the war to tell what had happened on that August day. Inside the camp, the SS surveyed the destruction with a cold fury. Several buildings had been reduced to ash. Dozens of guards were dead or wounded, and the killing process had been disrupted. Orders came swiftly from higher command. The camp was to be dismantled entirely, its evidence erased. Treblinka would no longer operate as an extermination center. Its machinery of death had been permanently broken, not by the will of its masters, but by the courage of its prisoners. The uprising had not destroyed Treblinka completely, nor had it saved most of those who fought, but it had shattered the illusion of total control that the Nazis had cultivated. Even in the heart of their most lethal creation, in the place designed to extinguish all hope, human beings had risen, fought, and, in some cases, escaped. The smoke that rose above the camp that day carried with it the proof that even in the most carefully constructed hell, defiance was still possible. The forest around Treblinka was no sanctuary in those first hours after the uprising. The trees offered shade and concealment, but they also held shadows that seemed alive with danger. For the men who had just crawled under the barbed wire or sprinted through the open fields, every sound carried a new weight. The crunch of a twig could mean another escaped prisoner, a friend or a stranger, or it could be the tread of boots in pursuit. Those who had made it beyond the camp's killing fences knew they had achieved only the first step of freedom. The second, and far harder, was survival. The German response had been swift. Orders were already radiating outward from Treblinka to nearby villages, to police stations, to the German garrisons scattered through the region. Find them. Kill them. Patrols fanned out from the camp almost immediately, a mixture of SS men, Ukrainian guards, and local collaborators who knew the land and its people intimately. They were not hunting in ignorance. They had years of experience in tracking fugitives, partisans, and Jews who had slipped through the net of deportation. They knew which farms might offer shelter and which forests could conceal a hiding place. The prisoners had no map, no food, and almost no weapons left after the escape. Many had run without even their shoes, their feet bloodied by the barbed wire and the hard ground, yet their minds were sharp with desperation. They knew the countryside was dangerous in every direction. To head toward Warsaw meant navigating areas crawling with German troops. To head deeper into the countryside meant risking betrayal from villagers who might see them as nothing more than a bounty. The forest itself was deceptive. In the daylight it seemed dense and protective, but at night it became a cold and alien space. Branches creaked in the wind like whispers, and the moonlight fell in broken patches, making it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. The escapees moved in small groups or alone, always listening for the distant snap of gunfire that marked where others had been found. Some were captured within hours. Patrol dogs, trained for this very purpose, caught their scent and followed relentlessly. Once cornered, there was little the fugitives could do. Many carried the last bullet for themselves, rather than be taken back to Treblinka. Others fought with their bare hands until the end. Those who managed to evade the first wave of searches began to face a different threat. Hunger. The uprising had been spontaneous, but not without preparation. Still, there had been no way to store provisions for the escape. After the adrenaline of the initial flight wore off, the need for food became sharp and gnawing. Wild berries, roots, and whatever could be scavenged from abandoned fields became the difference between life and death. Some survivors took the enormous risk of approaching isolated farms under the cover of darkness. The reactions of those they met varied wildly. There were those who slammed their doors, threatened to call the Germans, or even shot at the fugitives themselves. But there were others, quiet heroes whose names would never be recorded, who offered bread, water, and sometimes a barn to sleep in for the night. For the Germans, the escape was an insult that demanded an example. They ordered reprisals in the nearby villages, warning the locals that aiding the fugitives would mean collective punishment. Posters went up on walls and trees, offering rewards for information and death for those who withheld it. The price of a life was measured in kilograms of sugar, a bag of flour, or a bottle of vodka. In such an atmosphere, trust became the rarest of commodities. Escapes often traveled separately, fearing that even a fellow prisoner might inadvertently lead their pursuers to them. Still, bonds formed out of necessity. Two men might agree to watch each other's backs while one slept, or to share the spoils of a lucky raid on a storage shed. Night after night the survivors moved farther from Treblinka, but the camp was never far from their minds. Every rustle in the grass could be a patrol. Every distant voice could be speaking their death sentence. In the darkness some could still see the fires from the uprising glowing faintly on the horizon, a reminder of the comrades they had left behind. For the Germans, the manhunt was not merely about recapturing the escapees, it was also about erasing what had happened. If too many survived, the truth about Treblinka might spread beyond whispered rumors. The Nazis feared that word of the uprising, of the defiance within the camp, would undermine the terror that kept others obedient. The hunt stretched into days. Prisoners who had covered remarkable distances in the first frantic hours, now slowed, worn down by exhaustion, hunger, and their injuries. Blisters burst and bled, and infected wounds festered without treatment. Yet the will to live kept them moving, one more hill, one more stream, one more night in the woods. In rare cases, the escapees encountered partisans operating in the forests. These groups, themselves hunted, could offer shelter, weapons, and a chance to strike back at the occupiers. But joining them was no guarantee of safety. The Germans targeted the partisan camps with a brutal efficiency, and betrayal was an ever-present risk. As the days passed, the number of survivors dwindled, not only because of capture or death, but because the forest itself seemed to thin, opening into farmland where concealment was harder. The balance between hiding and seeking food became more perilous with each step. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, some did endure. Through cunning, luck, and the kindness of strangers, they avoided the patrols, found safe places to hide, and slowly began to imagine a life beyond the shadow of Treblinka. These were the few who would one day bear witness, not only to the horrors of the camp, but to the fierce, improbable will that had carried them through the hunt. By the second week after the uprising, the land around Treblinka had been combed again and again. Patrols had swept through the villages, searched the haylofts, overturned the carts, and questioned the farmers at gunpoint. The Germans and their auxiliaries moved in lines through the fields, their dogs sniffing every clump of grass, every ditch, every hollow beneath a fallen tree. For the survivors still at large, the initial blaze of escape had narrowed into a slow, grinding struggle. Each dawn brought the same calculations: where to hide until nightfall, where to find water, which direction to move without crossing a road watched by sentries. The summer heat beat down relentlessly, turning the shallow streams into trickles and filling the air with the hum of insects. The sun, which had once seemed like a blessing in the camp, now became a merciless glare, revealing every movement to watchful eyes. Some of the fugitives began to adapt to the rhythm of the hunt. They travelled only at night, lying motionless during the day in the thickest brush they could find. They learned to listen for the subtle difference between the steps of a foraging animal and the calculated tread of a man. When thirst became unbearable, they sought water under the cover of a heavy rain, using the noise to mask their presence. But even such discipline could not shield them entirely. Sometimes a child wandering in the woods would stumble upon them and run back to tell a parent. Sometimes an animal's startled cry would draw a patrol to investigate. The countryside was a web of risks, each thread vibrating with the movement of human lives. There were moments of piercing, almost unreal quiet in this flight, moments when the fugitives would look up through the trees and see the sunlight filtering like gold dust through the leaves, or when the smell of wild flowers on the wind would carry them briefly away from the world of manhunts and reprisals. Yet these moments were fragile. They shattered instantly with the crack of a branch or the far-off bark of a dog. For some, the decision was made to split from their companions entirely, hoping that travelling alone would make them harder to track. For others, the bonds formed in the camp were too strong to sever. They moved together, whispering their plans, watching over each other's sleep. It was a dangerous kind of loyalty. If one was caught, the other's fate was often sealed. But it also meant that no one was left to die alone in the woods. The Germans intensified their campaign by turning to the local population more aggressively. Notices were nailed to trees and doors, promising money and goods for information. The same posters promised death for those who offered shelter or even a crust of bread to an escape. Villagers who were sympathetic faced an impossible choice. To help meant risking not only their own life, but the lives of their children. And yet, some did help. Bread was left in a hollow stump. A bucket of water appeared at the edge of a field with no one in sight. A barn door was left unlatched for a single night. Such acts, small and fleeting, could mean the difference between life and death. The fugitives learned to read these silent gestures as signs of a human courage hidden beneath the fear. As the hunt dragged on, the Germans began to scale back their direct pursuit. They knew that hunger, exposure, and the hostility of the countryside would finish the work for them. Patrols were still sent out, but now the aim was less to comb the land inch by inch, and more to maintain an atmosphere of fear, making sure the survivors never felt truly safe enough to rest. For those still alive, the weeks blurred into a haze of fatigue. Their faces thinned, their voices grew hoarse from thirst, and their eyes became fixed on the horizon. Some dreamed of reaching the partisan groups they had heard about in whispered conversations in the camp. Others thought only of making it to the next dawn without being caught. Then came the moments when the hunt would erupt again into violence. A patrol might stumble upon a makeshift shelter and open fire before a word could be spoken. A collaborator might lead the Germans to a hidden group, resulting in a sudden chaotic firefight. The woods echoed with shouts, the snap of twigs underfoot, and the brutal final sound of bullets striking their mark. And yet a few always slipped through, ghosts among the trees. They crossed rivers under the cover of darkness, climbed into hay wagons to pass unseen through the villages, or disappeared into the cellars of sympathetic homes. By the time autumn began to turn the leaves, the Germans could no longer be certain who had lived and who had died. In the end, the hunt for the survivors became less about recapturing the escapees and more about erasing their story. The Germans would dismantle Treblinka itself, bulldozing the camp, planting lupins over the mass graves, and leaving only a false farmhouse to disguise what had stood there. They intended that no trace would remain, no witnesses, no evidence, no memory, but the fugitives who endured would prove them wrong. Scarred, hollow-eyed, and haunted, they would carry the truth in their voices, in scattered towns, and in whispered testimonies to trusted listeners. They would tell what they had seen and done. They would describe the uprising, the flames, the flight through the woods, and the relentless hunt that had followed. They had been prey, hunted like animals through the fields and forests of Poland. Yet, by surviving, even a handful of them had transformed the story. Treblinka had not only been a place of death, it had been a place where human beings, in the face of certain annihilation, had fought back and lived to tell of it. The decision to erase Treblinka was not sudden, though when it came, it was carried out with the same cold efficiency that had governed its operations from the first day. The uprising of August 2nd, 1943, had shattered the illusion of total control. Though most of the escapees had been killed, the fact that hundreds had breached the fences and scattered into the countryside was an affront to the German sense of order. It also raised an urgent danger. If enough of them survived, they could tell the world what had happened here. Reports from the east were already troubling for the Germans. Soviet forces were advancing, partisan activity was growing, and the once impregnable shield of Nazi control was fraying at the edges. And within the offices of Operation Reinhard, where the systematic extermination of the Jews in the general government had been organized, a question began to take shape: how much longer could these camps operate without being overrun? The answer, they knew, was not long. Treblinka had served its purpose by mid-1943. Most of the Jewish population from Warsaw, Białystok, Radom, and other districts targeted for deportation had already been murdered. Trainloads still came, but the volume was far less than in the summer of 1942, when the station had been a ceaseless arrival point for death. Sobibor and Belzec, the other camps of Reinhard, were also winding down. The plan was simple in its cruelty: dismantle the sites, obliterate the traces, scatter the remaining workers, and let time and silence bury the truth. For Treblinka, the order was clear: Nothing must remain to indicate that hundreds of thousands had been killed here. The SS officers who had commanded the camp understood this with a brutal clarity. Kurt Franz, the last commandant, took the role of supervisor in this final phase. The same precision that had been used to schedule transports and operate the gas chambers was now applied to their destruction. The first stage was the most grotesque, the disposal of the human remains, though much of this had already begun months earlier under Extermination 1005, the code name for the Nazi program to exhume the mass graves and burn the bodies. There was still an appalling amount of work to be done. Prisoners were forced to open the earth with picks and shovels, revealing the tangled layers of decomposed corpses. The smell, even after months of burning, was overwhelming, an almost tangible weight in the air, seeping into the hair and clothes of those forced to handle the remains. The exhumation crews were made up of the last surviving members of the Sonderkommando, men who had already been compelled to work at the heart of the killing process. Under guard, they dragged the remains to massive pyres, built of railway tracks set across concrete blocks. These rails became the grates upon which the bodies were stacked in layers, corpses, then wood, then more corpses. Gasoline was poured over them, and the fires were lit. The flames rose high enough to be seen from miles away, a ghastly beacon marking the erasure of lives. The Germans timed these burnings for periods when the wind carried the smell away from the nearby villages, but there was no way to fully conceal the evidence. Farmers in the area later remembered the thick, black smoke drifting across the fields, the acrid stench that clung to the air for days. For the prisoners, the work went on without pause, day after day, until the pits were emptied. Once the graves were exhumed and the ashes were crushed and scattered, the dismantling of the structures began. The gas chambers, once the heart of the killing operation, were torn down, brick by brick. The walls were smashed with sledgehammers, the rubble carted away or dumped into the pits that were then levelled with earth. The camp fences were stripped of their barbed wire, the wooden posts were chopped and burned, and the watchtowers came down next, their skeletal frames collapsing into the dust. The SS took care to salvage anything of value. Metal scraps, tools, even nails were collected and shipped away. The wood from the barracks was either burned or reused elsewhere in military installations. The Germans were methodical, as if they were dismantling a warehouse rather than a site of mass murder. Every nail pulled, every stone removed, was one more step toward obliterating the record of what had been done here. All of this was carried out under constant guard. The prisoners doing the work knew what awaited them. Once the camp was gone, no one expected to be allowed to live. They worked slowly when they could, not out of defiance, but because each day spent dismantling the camp was another day of life. Yet any attempt to delay too obviously was met with beatings or shootings. Even in this final phase, the SS maintained an air of normalcy in front of each other, as though Treblinka's dismantling were just another logistical operation. They laughed at mealtimes, took photographs, and joked with their dogs. But when they gave the orders to burn the last of the barracks, or to dig over the ground where the gas chambers had stood, there was an urgency in their eyes, an awareness that they were racing against the advance of history. By late autumn, the landscape was changing rapidly. The open spaces of the camp, once crisscrossed by paths trodden by thousands of doomed prisoners, became empty fields of churned soil. The sounds of hammering and demolition gave way to the quieter work of smoothing the ground, filling in the ditches, and erasing the outlines of the buildings. The Germans were already thinking about the next stage, not just removing the camp, but replacing it with something so ordinary that no one would suspect what had been there. They intended to plant the land, not with flowers, which might draw curiosity, but with crops, rye, barley, and lupins. that would take root and flourish in the disturbed soil. By the time the plants grew tall, the ground would appear untouched, just another patch of Polish farmland. The prisoners, though silent in the presence of the guards, could not ignore the bitter irony. They knew the land was soaked in the ashes of the dead, that every seed they planted would draw its nourishment from the remains beneath. It was a desecration so profound it defied words, yet it was also the final act in the Germans' plan to make Treblinka disappear from memory. And still, as winter approached, the work was not done. The SS wanted more than concealment. They wanted obliteration. By the start of winter in late 1943, the main work of dismantling Treblinka's physical infrastructure had been completed. Yet the SS remained unsatisfied. They understood that simply tearing down the buildings and scattering the ashes was not enough to erase the traces of mass murder. Their orders were to leave behind nothing that could draw suspicion, nothing that might provide even a fragment of evidence for the world to find once the war had turned against Germany. Treblinka was to become just another nondescript piece of countryside, its past buried under layers of deception and soil. The open pits, once used for exhumations and burnings, were filled in with sand and soil scraped from the surrounding area. The ground was tamped flat by prisoners wielding heavy tools, their feet and bodies sinking into the soft surface as they worked. Some of these pits were enormous, dozens of meters wide and deep, and even after filling them, the ground retained a slight sinking quality, as though it refused to forget what had been hidden within. The SS, however, paid no mind to such details. They ordered more soil, more sand, more leveling, until the surface appeared uniform and featureless. Where the gas chambers had stood, the ground was smoothed with a particular care. Any leftover rubble from the demolished buildings was either removed entirely or crushed and buried deep. The Germans were methodical in removing all traces of the foundations. The outlines of the structures, once clear to anyone approaching, were now gone, replaced by bare earth. Wooden stakes were driven into the soil to mark the rows for planting. It was at this point that the transformation from a killing center to an agricultural field began. The SS brought in sacks of rye, barley, and lupin seeds. Under their watch, the remaining Jewish prisoners, now numbering only a small fraction of the original workforce, planted the seeds in long, straight rows. The Germans insisted on precision. The fields had to look like any other in rural Poland, so that a passing traveler would think nothing unusual about them. Some of the guards even seemed to relish the irony. They joked among themselves that the crops would be the best in the district, thanks to the fertilizer beneath the soil. The prisoners heard these remarks in silence, though the cruelty of the words etched deep into their memories. Every handful of soil they turned contained fragments of ash, bone, and unburned remains. The very act of planting was a final humiliation, forcing them to take part in disguising the murder of their own people. But as the fields took shape, the SS brought in a small wooden farmhouse to be erected on the site. This was not for accommodation, but as part of the cover story. A Ukrainian guard, along with his family, was to live here, tending the fields and keeping up the appearance of an ordinary rural homestead. This way, anyone wandering near Treblinka after the war would see nothing but a working farm complete with livestock and crops, and never suspect the horror that lay beneath. The farmhouse was simple, built from reclaimed wood and surrounded by a modest fence. Chickens scratched in the dirt, and a few goats grazed nearby. Even this was calculated. Livestock droppings and farmyard smells would mask any lingering odor from the mass graves below. The SS were not only erasing the visual evidence of Treblinka, but were also trying to overwrite the sensory memory of the place. But even as they worked to conceal Treblinka, the Germans knew that loose ends had to be tied. The most obvious loose ends were the prisoners themselves. Those who had labored in the dismantling knew too much. They had seen the camp in full operation, had handled the dead, had taken apart the gas chambers brick by brick. No matter how carefully the Germans destroyed the camp, these living witnesses could betray its existence with a single testimony. The prisoners, aware of their fate, worked under an oppressive shadow. Every day they expected to be taken into the woods and shot. Some thought of escape, but with the camp now surrounded by open fields rather than fences, it was in some ways harder to slip away unnoticed. The guards were more watchful than ever, and yet a few did try, darting away during the planting work, using the tall rye or lupin rows as temporary cover. Most were caught quickly and executed in full view of the others as a warning. When the last rows of crops were planted, and the ground showed no visible sign of the camp, the SS moved to the final act. Small groups of prisoners were taken away under the pretense of being transferred to other work details. In reality, they were marched into the forest and shot, their bodies buried in shallow graves which were then camouflaged with fallen branches and leaves. This process continued until only a handful of skilled laborers remained, men who could still be used for work at other sites. Those too were eventually executed or sent to other camps where survival was unlikely. By early 1944, Treblinka as a physical entity had ceased to exist. Where once there had been fences, barracks, watchtowers, gas chambers, and the pits of the dead, there was now a quiet farmstead with neat fields and a solitary farmhouse. The nearby railway siding was dismantled, its tracks taken away for use elsewhere. The path that had once carried the endless transports of human beings to their deaths was overgrown with weeds and grass. Yet, even as the Germans congratulated themselves on their thoroughness, they could not erase everything. Deep in the soil, fragments of bone remained. Tiny beads, coins, and personal trinkets, lost by the victims, still lay scattered underground. And in the minds of the few survivors who had escaped before the dismantling began, the memory of Treblinka remained vivid and unshakable. The SS had built the camp in secrecy and operated it in silence, believing that its destruction would remove it from history altogether. But history is stubborn. The winds would shift, the war would turn, and in time others would come to dig, to uncover, and to speak of what had happened here. For now, though, in the waning months of the German occupation, Treblinka had vanished from the map. The cries, the smoke, the endless trains, all were replaced by the quiet rustle of crops in the breeze and the low bleating of goats. And to the casual passerby, it was just another farm in the Polish countryside, unremarkable and unmarked, its terrible secret hidden beneath a thin skin of soil. When Treblinka was finally silenced in late 1943, its killers walked away with the chilling certainty that they had erased it from the face of the earth. The farmhouse stood in the place of the gas chambers. Rye fields waved in the wind where the pits of ash had once gaped open, and the railway spur had been lifted and scattered for scrap. No one was meant to know, and no one, they thought, would ever know. For the men of the SS, this was not merely about covering their tracks. It was about rewriting reality, sealing the camp not only in the ground but in a tomb of silence. Yet, the war was far from over. In the first months after the dismantling, the region lay under the same heavy hand of German occupation, and those who lived near the site adapted to a strange new normal. Villagers passing on the distant road would glance at the farm and see a man tending his goats, a woman hanging her laundry, and perhaps a child chasing chickens. It was ordinary enough to the casual eye, yet the ground beneath told a different story to those who had been there before. The soil was soft in strange places, the air on damp days carried a faint metallic tang, and certain stretches of the earth, no matter how many seeds were sown, refused to sprout evenly. The land itself seemed unwilling to forget. But for a time this was all hidden beneath the greater storm of the war. By early 1944, the Eastern Front was shifting dramatically. The Soviet forces, hardened by years of brutal fighting, were beginning their slow push westward after the turning point at Stalingrad. Each month, the German grip on the occupied territory loosened, though not without a ferocious resistance. The land between the Bug River and Warsaw was becoming a contested zone, with German units falling back and Soviet spearheads probing forward. In January 1944, the sounds of the war crept closer. Artillery thudding in the distance, columns of retreating German troops moving along the frozen roads, wagons creaking under the weight of the supplies that could still be salvaged. The Ukrainian Guard family, installed at the Treblinka farmstead, continued their daily routine, but now under a growing uncertainty. German officers arrived less frequently to check on the property. The Guard himself, once stiff and dutiful, now spent more time peering nervously toward the eastern horizon than tending the fields. For the villagers in the surrounding area, the signs were unmistakable. German confidence was fading. The once regular trains, loaded with military supplies, now traveled west nearly empty. Small groups of soldiers moved in haste, sometimes abandoning their equipment by the roadside. At night, the low thunder of distant combat grew louder and more frequent. By spring, rumors had spread that the Soviets had crossed the pre-war Polish border in several places. As the front drew nearer, the Germans began a hurried, uneven withdrawal from some of the rural areas, focusing their forces on the major towns and defensive lines. The Treblinka farmstead, once a carefully maintained disguise, lost its strategic value. Sometime in the early summer of 1944, the Ukrainian Guard family disappeared. Whether recalled by the Germans, evacuated with the retreating units, or simply fleeing on their own, no one could say for certain. The farmhouse stood empty, its door banging in the wind, the fields gone to seed. Weeds and wildflowers began to creep back over the once orderly rows of crops. When the Soviet advance finally reached this part of Poland in late July 1944, the war arrived not as a dramatic pitched battle at the site itself, but as a rolling wave of liberation. Red Army units, pushing west, crossed the Bug River, and fanned out through the countryside, clearing the villages, securing the roads, and searching for remnants of the retreating Wehrmacht. For the soldiers, the farm that stood where Treblinka had been was little more than an unremarkable dot on their maps, a patch of land to cross on the way to larger objectives. It was not the Soviets' initial mission to investigate such sites. Their priority was to keep moving, to drive the Germans back before they could regroup. Yet, as they passed through the area, local villagers approached the soldiers, speaking in urgent tones about what had once stood here. Some pointed toward the overgrown fields, lowering their voices as if they were still afraid to speak too loudly. Others gestured to the railway embankment, recalling the endless trains that had once run day and night, always in, never out. The soldiers listened, but the place before them did not match the horrors that were described. Where they expected to find fences and barracks, there was open farmland. The farmhouse was deserted, the interior dusty and empty, except for a few discarded tools and a broken chair. The ground was uneven, with patches of yellowed grass and disturbed soil, but it was easy to dismiss these as the normal scars of a wartime occupation. Still, the stories persisted, and some of the Soviet officers took an interest. They began walking the fields, probing the ground with their bayonets, noticing how the soil yielded too easily in certain spots. In some areas, a foul, acrid odor seemed to seep upward when the earth was disturbed. A few fragments of bone were found, small, brittle, and weathered by time, but undeniably human. It was enough to raise suspicion. The Soviets did not have time for a full investigation. In those first days, the front was still moving, and the need to press on toward Warsaw was urgent. But they marked the location, made notes, and spoke to the villagers who were willing to share what they had seen during the years of occupation. Those conversations were often halting and painful. Some villagers admitted they had heard screams from the direction of the camp at night, or had seen columns of people marched from the train station toward the woods. Others said they had caught the stench of burning flesh on the wind, and there were a few who admitted, with shame or defiance, that they had scavenged items from the site after the Germans had left, coins, watches, bits of clothing, never fully understanding, or choosing not to understand, the full meaning of where they had come from. In the weeks that followed, the Red Army pushed far to the west, and Treblinka lay in a quiet zone behind the front. That quiet was deceptive. The farmstead had been abandoned to the elements, and the cover of the crops and livestock was gone. Without the constant human presence, the land began to reveal small, unsettling clues. Heavy rains in the late summer caused parts of the filled-in pits to sink, creating shallow depressions. In these hollows, shards of bone and scraps of cloth sometimes emerged. Children from the nearby villages, wandering too far from home, found buttons, spoons, or teeth. By the time the Soviet investigators could return with more time and resources, Treblinka had begun to speak again, not in the loud horror of its operation, but in the quiet persistence of evidence that refused to stay buried. The Germans had dismantled the buildings, torn up the tracks, burned the bodies, and scattered the ashes. But the soil had kept its memory, and as the Soviets began to piece together the truth, they realized that what lay beneath these fields was not merely a crime scene, but one of the largest graves in human history. The return of the Soviet investigators to Treblinka in the autumn of 1944 was not the dramatic uncovering of a forgotten ruin. It was more like listening to a whisper from the ground and trying to piece together the words. The war still raged, and resources were thin. Teams of military prosecutors, forensic examiners, and photographers arrived with limited equipment, guided by the locals who pointed out the places where the earth seemed strange. The first days were spent walking the perimeter, trying to imagine what had once stood there. Without the structures, the investigators had to rely on the land itself. The railway siding was gone, but a faint embankment remained, a scar running toward the main line. At the edge of the woods, they noticed shallow depressions, irregular, as though the earth had collapsed over something hollow beneath. In some places, the smell was unmistakable. When the shovels broke the surface, they found layers of grey ash mixed with human bone fragments, charred wood, and twisted bits of metal. Witnesses from the surrounding villages were questioned. Some spoke of seeing the endless trains, the cattle cars sealed except for small, barred openings. They described prisoners being forced to unload in haste, driven by shouting guards and barking dogs. Others remembered the smoke rising day and night from the direction of the camp, the air thick with a stench so foul that people kept their windows closed even in the summer. One man recalled hearing gunshots in the distance, always in bursts, and noticing that the noise had stopped abruptly in late 1943. But the most compelling testimonies came from the survivors of the August 2nd, 1943, Uprising, those few who had escaped through the fences and had lived to tell of it. They arrived at the site with their Soviet escorts, their faces pale at the sight of the altered landscape. One of them, a young man who had once been assigned to work in the lazaret area, knelt down and touched the soil. He told the investigators that under this very patch of ground had been a pit where the bodies of the sick and wounded were dumped before being cremated. Another pointed toward the edge of the field, describing the location of the gas chambers in exact detail, his voice trembling as he spoke of the men, women, and children who had passed through them. The Soviets recorded these accounts carefully. They knew that the testimony would be crucial because the physical evidence was fragmentary. The Germans' destruction of Treblinka had been thorough, an operation planned with the same cold efficiency that had governed the camp's daily function. Yet even their attempt at erasure had been imperfect. The forensic teams sifted through the soil, finding coins, wedding rings, metal clasps from clothing, hairpins, and even children's marbles. Each artifact was catalogued and photographed, a mute witness to the lives that had ended here. They also uncovered what appeared to be the remnants of the cremation grates, long corroded rails laid across stone supports, stained with a residue that no one could mistake. The smell still clung to them, faint but undeniable. Scattered nearby were hundreds of bullets and shell casings, evidence of the executions carried out both before and during the dismantling. The investigation quickly revealed the scale of the crime. Conservative estimates, based on railway records and survivor testimony, suggested that between 700,000 and 900,000 people had been murdered at Treblinka in just over a year of operation. Many of the victims had been Jews, deported from the Warsaw ghetto after the uprising there in April 1943. Others had come from across occupied Europe, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, and beyond. A smaller number were Romani families, Soviet POWs, and Polish political prisoners. The Soviet findings were compiled into reports that would later be used in war crimes trials, both in the USSR and internationally. But in 1944, the priority was still to defeat Germany. The documents were archived, the photographs were stored, and Treblinka once again fell silent, at least in the physical sense. The farm remained abandoned through the bitter winter of 1944-45, its fields buried in snow. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the world's attention was drawn to the major cities and the liberation of the better-known camps, like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Treblinka, without its surviving buildings, and with only a handful of living witnesses, risked fading from public awareness. Many in the West had never even heard the name. Yet, among the survivors, in the Jewish communities across Europe, and in the displaced persons camps that sprang up after the war, Treblinka was spoken of with a mixture of horror and reverence. It was not just another camp. It was the place where whole towns had vanished in a single train journey. The survivors began to organize, gathering testimony and writing down their memories before time and trauma could erode them. Some returned to the site, standing on the fields and struggling to reconcile the peaceful countryside with the inferno they remembered. A few planted small markers, stones with Hebrew inscriptions, wooden crosses, anything that could signify that this was not an ordinary farm but a graveyard on an unimaginable scale. In the late 1940s, the Polish authorities began their own investigations, building on the Soviet findings. They interviewed the villagers, tracked down the former guards who had fled into hiding, and continued the slow work of excavation. Court proceedings in Poland brought some of the perpetrators to justice, though many escaped trial for years. The most infamous among them, Commandant Franz Stangl, would not be captured until the late 1960s. By the 1950s, the need for a proper memorial at Treblinka was recognized, though the political realities in post-war Poland delayed any large-scale efforts. Survivors and Jewish organizations abroad pressed for a commemoration, warning that without a monument, the site could easily be forgotten. Eventually, in the early 1960s, work began on creating a memorial park. The design was stark and symbolic, an expanse of jagged stones representing the destroyed communities, with a central monument rising from the ground like a fractured tombstone. There were no reconstructed barracks or gas chambers, no museum building, only the earth itself, scarred and silent as the ultimate witness. Even with a memorial in place, the full truth of Treblinka's story continued to unfold over the decades. New archaeological methods in the 21st century, such as ground-penetrating radar, confirmed the locations of the mass graves and other features without disturbing the remains. These findings validated the survivor accounts with a chilling precision. Today, Treblinka is both a site of education and a place of mourning. Visitors walk along the paths, bordered by wildflowers, and hear the wind in the trees, knowing that beneath their feet lie the ashes of hundreds of thousands. The land that the Nazis had tried to erase now speaks louder than ever, its silence an indictment more powerful than any speech. And those who come here leave with the understanding that disappearance is not the same as oblivion. Treblinka may have been dismantled, but it did not vanish. It remains etched in the soil, in the survivors' memories, and in the conscience of the world. In the years following the war, Treblinka existed in two forms: the physical site itself, stripped bare by its architects of destruction, and the memory that persisted in the minds of the survivors, the witnesses, and the families of those who never returned. These two forms of existence were intertwined but not identical. The land was mute and still, holding within it the remains and the secrets of nearly 1 million lives, while the memory was restless, urgent, and fragile, threatened by the erosion of time, by disbelief, and by the sheer scale of the horror which defied easy comprehension. For many survivors, speaking about Treblinka in the immediate aftermath of the liberation was a near impossibility. The shock of survival, the absence of family, and the displacement into refugee camps or foreign countries created a silence that was as heavy as any stone memorial. Some survivors found themselves in places where no one had heard of Treblinka, where the Holocaust itself was barely understood, and where the idea of extermination camps seemed too grotesque to be real. They would sometimes begin to speak, and then stop midway, sensing skepticism in the listener's eyes, or realizing that words could not bridge the gap between their memories and the ordinary world. Yet, the silence could not last forever. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a small number of survivor accounts began to appear, often in memoirs privately published in Yiddish or Polish, sometimes in English translations for the Jewish communities abroad. These books were rarely bestsellers. They were labors of grief and duty, intended as testimony rather than as literature. Still, they began to plant the seeds of Treblinka's place in the public consciousness. Authors like Samuel Willenberg, who had escaped during the August 1943 Uprising, wrote with a clarity and urgency that made it impossible to ignore the truth. Their accounts were not merely about suffering, they were about resistance, survival, and the moral imperative to remember. In Poland, the site of Treblinka remained under state control, its physical preservation complicated by the political realities of the time. The communist government, while committed to documenting Nazi crimes, often framed them within the narrative of an anti-fascist struggle rather than focusing on the specifically Jewish nature of the genocide. This meant that for years, the memorial at Treblinka, like those at other camps, was presented as a site of Polish martyrdom in general, with only a subtle acknowledgement of the Jewish catastrophe that had occurred there. It was not until later decades that the inscriptions explicitly naming the Jewish victims became standard. Still, the 1960s brought a significant shift in Treblinka's place in the global conversation, largely due to the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. Survivors from across the Holocaust were called to testify, and among them were those who had lived through Treblinka. The televised trial reached millions, and for the first time many people outside of Poland heard direct, detailed descriptions of the camp's function, its machinery of death, and the uprising that had destroyed much of it. Though the trial focused on Eichmann's role in orchestrating the deportations, Treblinka's name was spoken repeatedly, anchoring it in the public memory alongside Auschwitz and Sobibor. The Eichmann trial was followed by another landmark event, the 1964-65 trial of Franz Stangl, Treblinka's commandant in West Germany. Stangl had fled to Brazil after the war and had lived there under his own name until a journalist tracked him down. His extradition and trial were covered extensively in the press. Survivors testified in person, facing the man who had once overseen their near-certain deaths. Stangl did not deny the camp's existence or its function, but he sought to portray himself as a mere administrator, claiming he had had no power to alter the orders from above. His conviction and life sentence, though he died in prison only a few years later, were seen as a partial justice, a rare case in which a high-ranking Operation Reinhard official was held accountable. Meanwhile, the physical site of Treblinka was transformed into a memorial landscape that reflected both absence and presence. The central monument, unveiled in 1964, was surrounded by 17,000 jagged stone shards, each representing a destroyed community. Their arrangement suggested a shattered world, frozen in place, their sharp edges cutting into the sky. Visitors walking among them could not help but feel the weight of the void they marked. Unlike museums filled with artifacts, Treblinka offered no reconstructed barracks, no recreated watchtowers, only the stones, the forest, and the open fields. The effect was haunting, as though the silence itself were part of the memorial. For the survivors returning to the site, the experience was often overwhelming. Some wept openly. Others stood in stillness, tracing with their fingers the Hebrew names carved into a handful of the stones. A few brought soil from Treblinka back to their adopted countries, placing it on graves or scattering it in their synagogues as a symbolic reunion of the dead with their communities. In this way, Treblinka's physical remains began to travel the world, carried in small jars and folded paper envelopes, extending the memorial far beyond Poland's borders. In literature, Treblinka became a symbol not only of destruction, but also of resistance against oblivion. Jean-François Steiner's 1966 book, Treblinka, based on survivor interviews, became a sensation in France and was translated into multiple languages. Though its novelistic style blended fact with reconstructed dialogue, it helped to fix the uprising of 1943 in the public imagination. The book's popularity demonstrated that Treblinka could be spoken of in ways that reached a broad audience without diminishing the gravity of its history. As the decades passed, however, a new challenge emerged: Holocaust denial. By the late 1970s and 1980s, individuals and groups began spreading claims that the extermination camps were fabrications or exaggerations. Treblinka, with its lack of surviving structures, was particularly targeted. Deniers argued that the absence of gas chambers proved they had never existed. In response, historians and forensic researchers marshaled the overwhelming evidence from documents, testimonies, and the physical traces that still lay beneath the soil. Archaeological surveys confirmed the locations of the mass graves and the cremation pits without disturbing them, countering denial with science. By the early 21st century, Treblinka had become a site of pilgrimage, not only for Jews but also for scholars, students, and travelers seeking to confront the past. Guided tours led visitors through the memorial, the path of the railway, and the areas identified as the burial grounds. Educational programs incorporated survivor testimony, archival photographs, and maps to bring the story to life. International collaborations funded preservation efforts to ensure that erosion, weather, and neglect would not erase what remained. And yet, for all the history books, documentaries, and memorial ceremonies, Treblinka remained elusive in one sense. It was a place defined as much by what was absent as by what was present. The Nazis had tried to obliterate it physically. The survivors had worked tirelessly to preserve it in memory. Between these two forces, the camp became both nowhere and everywhere, a vanished landscape that continued to shape lives far beyond its boundaries. The survivors of Treblinka, scattered across the continents, carried the camp within them like a shadow that never lifted. Even decades later, their conversations would sometimes fall into sudden silences when memories surfaced unexpectedly: a smell, a train whistle, a turn of phrase in a stranger's voice. Many lived with the knowledge that they were the final living witnesses, a dwindling link to a time that would soon pass beyond living memory. This awareness drove them to speak in classrooms, at commemorations, and in recorded testimonies for archives like the USC Shoah Foundation. Sitting before a camera, some survivors found themselves telling their stories in full for the first time. Their words, preserved digitally for generations yet unborn, often revealed details that were absent from the earlier written accounts, not because they had been forgotten, but because there had once been no space for them. A survivor might describe, in halting speech, the texture of the sand in the camp yard, the sound of boots striking the wooden ramps of the incoming trains, or the sight of the smoke rising in thin columns against the winter sky. Others spoke of moments of fleeting kindness, a crust of bread shared by a fellow prisoner, or of choices that haunted them, decisions made under impossible conditions. Together, these recollections deepened the record, offering not only facts but the emotional truth of what it meant to live through Treblinka. In Israel, Treblinka's memory was bound into the broader tapestry of Holocaust remembrance. Yad Vashem included it prominently in its exhibitions, and school trips to Poland often featured the camp as a stop, alongside Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek. Young Israelis stood among the jagged stones, listening to guides recount the uprising and the destruction of the camp, sometimes with a survivor present to speak in person. These visits often left a lasting impression, inspiring essays, poems, and, in some cases, life paths dedicated to historical preservation. In the Jewish diaspora, particularly in the United States and Canada, Treblinka was remembered in synagogue sermons on Holocaust Remembrance Day, in community memorial services, and in family stories passed quietly from parent to child. Memorial plaques in Jewish centers listed the towns whose populations had been annihilated in Treblinka, preserving names that might otherwise have vanished from collective awareness. Some descendants of the survivors took on the responsibility of telling their parents' or grandparents' stories at schools and public events, believing that the duty of memory had to be shared, not left to fade with the last eyewitnesses. Beyond the Jewish communities, Treblinka's history gradually entered the wider public consciousness through literature, cinema, and academic research. Documentaries such as Claude Lanzmann's monumental show devoted extensive time to survivor interviews, giving them the space to recount their experiences without interruption or dramatization. Lanzmann's refusal to use archival footage meant that viewers encountered Treblinka not through images of its past, but through the words and expressions of those who had been there, standing in the present-day landscape as they spoke. This approach underscored the camp's absence, the way its physical erasure had become part of its story.